Hello, welcome back, midnight listeners, to Black Screen Horror. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? And if the darkness is calling to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss what's hiding in the next black screen. Now turn off the lights, sink into the silence, because what's about to begin is real. Before I get into everything that happened, I want to make one thing clear. I am not a spiritual person at all, and I am definitely not religious. I have never messed around with anything that could be considered supernatural. No Ouija boards, no rituals, nothing like that. I have always been the type of person who rolls my eyes at ghost stories and assumes there is a normal explanation for pretty much everything. So when I say that a series of strange events happened in my house over the course of a couple of years, and that they eventually forced me to question my own skepticism, I want you to understand that I did not want to believe any of it. It just kept happening anyway. It all started late one night, sometime around 1 or 2 in the morning. I was in my room, wide awake, when I suddenly heard a loud smacking sound coming from the living room. Everyone else in the house was already asleep at that hour, so it was just me. The sound completely freaked me out. I turned on every light in my room, pushed my bookshelf up against my bedroom door so nothing could get in, and sat there fully expecting the worst, ready to text my family the second anything else happened. I stayed like that for a while, tense and alert, but nothing else happened that night. The next morning, everything looked completely normal, nothing out of place anywhere in the house. Then, the very next night, at around the same time, I heard the exact same smacking sound again. The following morning, I discovered that a small picture frame, one of those little one-legged frames that lean against something to stay upright, had fallen over. It was a photo of me, my dad, and my brother together. What struck me as strange was the way it had fallen. If the leg on the back had simply slipped or given out, the frame should have fallen backward, away from where it was standing. Instead, it had fallen forward, landing completely face down, which did not match how that kind of frame usually falls. It was odd, definitely enough to make me pause, but I brushed it off and moved on with my day. Months went by after that, maybe close to a year, before anything else strange happened. Up on a shelf near the ceiling in my room, I had some old hollow paper statues that had been sitting there for a long time. One of them was a red Bedtime head from back when I used to be really into his music. That statue had not been touched or moved in ages. Then one night, again around 1 or 2 in the morning, it suddenly fell off the shelf right in front of me while I was in the room. At first, I figured maybe the ceiling fan had finally knocked it loose after all that time, even though the statue had a cardboard base that was glued on specifically to weigh it down and keep it from tipping over easily. The next day, I was out in the living room after dinner, just relaxing with my dad and our dog, the way we usually did in the evenings. At some point, I went back to my room, and that is when I noticed something that did not sit right with me at all. The Bedtime head was no longer where it had fallen. It was now sitting upright, standing on its base, positioned directly in front of my closet door, a good 6 to 8 inches away from where it would have landed if it had simply toppled off the shelf on its own. What made this even stranger was the layout of the house. From where I had been sitting in the living room with my dad, I had a clear line of sight straight into the doorway of my bedroom. If anyone had walked in or out of my room during that time, I would have seen them. Nobody did. Again, I tried to brush it off and convince myself there was some normal explanation, even though by that point I was genuinely creeped out. The following night, my dad and I were back on the couch together, watching a show, with our dog curled up and relaxing on my lap the way she normally did. Out of absolutely nowhere, she sprang up off my lap and bolted straight toward my bedroom, standing right at the open doorway and barking into the room. I tried to explain it away by telling myself that my room faced the front of the house and looked out onto the street, so maybe she was reacting to something outside, a car or a person walking by. But she had never once done anything like that in all the months we had owned her up to that point. Easily around 6 months by then. The next morning, I woke up with a severe migraine, somewhere between 7:30 and 8 in the morning. My vision was rough, partly from the migraine, and partly because the entire house was flooded with bright morning light streaming in through the windows. I made my way to the kitchen looking for medication, and that is when I finally noticed it. Every single one of the upper kitchen cabinet doors was standing wide open. All of them, lined up across the kitchen. I immediately texted my dad, assuming he must have left them open for some reason, but he said he had not touched them. My brother was still completely asleep in his room and had not been anywhere near the kitchen. At that point, I started to genuinely panic. This was not something I could easily explain away with a normal, boring reason, and it was not something I could keep ignoring either. I tried to calm myself down and texted a friend of mine who is much more spiritual than I am, someone who believes in things like karma and the alignment of the planets. She told me that burning sage was considered one of the most effective ways to clear out spirits or negative energy from a space, and when I looked it up myself online, I found a lot of similar advice saying the same thing. At that point, I figured, even if it made me feel a little ridiculous, it was worth trying. So I went out, bought some sage, came back home, lit it, and walked through every single room of the house with it, the way I had read you were supposed to do. After that, which happened last year, the entire house felt noticeably different. Calmer, emptier. In a good way. Peaceful, for lack of a better word. Everything stayed quiet for a long stretch of time after that, all the way up until last month. I was in the living room again, in the same spot where I could clearly see straight into my bedroom doorway, when I heard a loud crash of something falling inside my room. My dog immediately sprang up, clearly startled and agitated. I rushed into my room to check and found several books from my bookshelf lying scattered on the floor. Books that had not been moved, touched, or even looked at in months, possibly years. They looked like they had been deliberately pulled off the shelf rather than having simply fallen on their own. At that point, I basically said to myself, out loud, that I was done dealing with this, and I was not interested in figuring out a polite way to describe my reaction. I ran straight out, grabbed more sage, and repeated the entire cleansing process throughout the house again. Since then, things have gone quiet once more. I have learned through this whole experience that burning sage is not some kind of permanent, one-time fix. It seems like it is something that might need to be repeated from time to time to keep whatever this is from coming back. Even so, to this day, I still try to find normal explanations first for anything strange that happens. And I only consider the possibility of some kind of entity being involved as an absolute last resort, after every other explanation has been ruled out. I am sharing all of this because for most of my life, I genuinely believed that ghost stories were exaggerated at best and completely made up at worst. But living through all of this in a house that is over 20 years old eventually forced me to accept a few uncomfortable possibilities. That whatever has been happening seems oddly fixated on me specifically, and that it is entirely possible someone died in this house at some point before we moved in, which might explain what we have all been experiencing. One more detail I want to add. My grandmother, completely on her own, once told me and my dad about something that happened to her while she was visiting us. She was sitting on the couch reading a book when she suddenly felt a hand rest on her shoulder, even though there was nobody else in the room with her at the time. She was not trying to scare us or make a point when she told us this. She just mentioned it casually, like it had genuinely happened to her. So at the very least, I know I am not the only person in my family who has been made aware that something is here with us. Back when I was in high school, I had a good friend named Steve. We were part of the same group of friends, the kind of group that spent most of our time joking around, sharing weird stories, and trying to convince each other that whatever strange thing we had heard online was either completely true or total nonsense. One day during our freshman year, sometime around 2007, Steve told us a story about something that had supposedly happened to his older brother, Tim, a couple of years before. At first, none of us knew what to make of it. Even Steve admitted that he was not completely sure whether every part of the story was true. It was one of those things his brother had told him, and although Tim apparently seemed serious about it, the whole thing sounded almost too strange to believe. Tim had been going to college somewhere in New Hampshire at the time. I never learned exactly where the school was, and I do not know enough about New Hampshire to understand the geography perfectly, but from the way Steve described it. Tim's college was in an area surrounded by a lot of wooded roads and long stretches of highway. One night, at around 2 in the morning, Tim and one of his close friends were awake and suddenly decided they wanted Dunkin' Donuts. Not coffee from a vending machine, not snacks from a gas station. They specifically wanted Dunkin' Donuts. The problem was that the nearest one was apparently far enough away that they had to cross state lines to get there. At 2 in the morning, that probably should have been enough reason to forget the whole idea and go back to sleep, but college students do stupid things when they are tired and hungry. Tim and his friend got into the car and started driving. The trip there was apparently normal. They drove through the dark, eventually found the Dunkin' Donuts, bought whatever they wanted, and started heading back toward the college. That was when things became strange. According to Tim, the route back included a narrow highway that passed through a heavily wooded area. There were not many buildings around and not much traffic at that hour. The trees came close to the road on both sides, and beyond the reach of the headlights, there was nothing except darkness. It was exactly the kind of road that felt different at 2 in the morning than it would during the day. During daylight, it probably would have looked peaceful. At night, it felt isolated. Tim and his friend were driving along when another car appeared. It was a small red compact car. There was nothing especially unusual about that at first. Cars sometimes appeared even on empty roads late at night. Maybe another driver was heading home from work. Maybe someone else was traveling between towns. But as the car moved in front of them, Tim began noticing details that bothered him. Most of the markings on the car seemed to have been scratched off or removed. There were no obvious badges or logos that helped identify the make or model. It was simply a red compact car with a strangely blank appearance. The one thing that stood out was the license plate. Tim could not remember a normal plate number. What he remembered were 2 characters, a black O, a green M. That was it. Those were the details that stuck in his mind, a black O and a green M. For the rest of the story, Steve simply called the driver, or maybe the car itself, At first, did not do anything openly threatening. The car simply drove ahead of Tim and his friend. Then other strange things started happening. Tim noticed that his phone suddenly lost service. By itself, that was not especially frightening. They were driving through a wooded area in New Hampshire, probably far away from the nearest cell tower. Losing service in an isolated place was completely believable. Then, something strange happened with the radio. Tim had been listening to a jazz station. Suddenly, the station began playing Smells Like Teen Spirit. Again, maybe there was a reasonable explanation. Radio stations sometimes played unusual songs. Signals overlapped. Stations changed formats. Equipment malfunctioned. None of those things meant anything supernatural was happening. Even Tim apparently understood that. The phone could have lost service because they were in the woods. The song could have been a strange coincidence. But sitting inside a car on an empty highway at 2 in the morning with a strange red vehicle directly in front of you, little coincidences start feeling much larger. Tim and his friend both began feeling uncomfortable. They could not explain exactly why. Ohm had not slammed on the brakes. The driver had not tried to run them off the road. Nobody had pointed a weapon out of the window. There was simply something wrong about the situation. Tim decided he did not want to stay close to the red car. He eased his foot off the gas. His plan was simple. Let Ohm continue ahead. Put some distance between them. In a few minutes, the red car would disappear into the darkness, and Tim and his friend could continue back to college without thinking about it again. Except Ohm slowed down too. Tim noticed almost immediately. He had reduced his speed, and the red car had done the same thing. The distance between them remained nearly identical. At first, Tim wondered whether it was another coincidence. Maybe the driver ahead had simply decided to slow down. Maybe there was something on the road. Maybe the driver had noticed a curve approaching. Tim slowed down a little more. Ohm slowed down again. Now Tim's friend noticed it too. The uncomfortable feeling inside the car became much stronger. They were being watched. Or followed. Except Ohm was in front of them. That somehow made it even stranger. Tim decided to try the opposite approach. Instead of slowing down, he pressed the gas. If the red car was simply moving slowly, Tim could pass it. He accelerated. Ohm accelerated too. Tim increased his speed. The red car matched him. Every time Tim tried to create distance, Ohm adjusted. If Tim slowed down, Ohm slowed down. If Tim sped up, Ohm sped up. The red car seemed determined to remain the exact same distance in front of them. By that point, Tim and his friend were no longer joking about it. They were scared. There was no normal reason for another driver to behave like that. Maybe it was someone trying to intimidate them. Maybe the driver was drunk. Maybe it was some kind of road rage situation, although Tim could not remember doing anything that would have angered anyone. Whatever the explanation was, neither of them wanted to find out. The problem was that they were trapped on the highway. They could not simply turn around. They could not call anyone because Tim's phone had no signal. There were no stores or houses nearby. Only the road, the woods, their headlights, and on. Then they noticed a curve coming up. The highway bent around an area of trees, meaning that for a few seconds the red car would disappear from view. Tim watched Ohm go around the curve. The moment the car vanished, Tim made a decision. He stopped, not slowed down. Stopped completely. They sat there in the middle of the dark road. The engine continued running. The headlights shone across the pavement ahead. The woods stood silently on either side of them. Tim and his friend stared toward the curve where Ohm had disappeared. They expected the red car to keep going. That was the plan. If Ohm continued driving at normal speed, then every second they waited would increase the distance between them. Soon the red car would be miles away. The strange encounter would be over. The two of them waited. Neither could remember exactly how long they sat there. Later, Tim guessed that it might have been 20 minutes. Maybe it was less. Fear has a strange effect on time. A few minutes can feel like half an hour when you are sitting on an empty highway wondering whether someone is waiting for you around the next bend. They talked quietly inside the car. Should they turn around? Should they keep waiting? What if Ohm had stopped too? What if the driver came back? Eventually, they realized they could not stay there forever. They had to get back to college. Tim slowly started driving again. He approached the curve. Both of them watched the road ahead carefully. Maybe Ohm had finally left. Maybe they would see nothing except empty highway. Tim rounded the corner, and there was Alm. The red compact car was directly ahead of them, not far down the highway, not parked on the shoulder, not turning around. It was driving, and according to Tim, it was the exact same distance in front of them as before. That was the part of the story that always bothered me most. If Tim and his friend had stopped for even 5 minutes, Ohm should have been far away. If they had stopped for 20 minutes, Ohm should have been several miles ahead. Instead, the red car appeared exactly where it had been before. It was almost as if the road between them had never changed. Tim and his friend completely lost their nerve. Whatever explanation they had tried to create before no longer mattered. They simply wanted to get home. They continued driving. Ohm stayed ahead of them. The red car maintained the distance. Nobody inside Tim's car said much. They were probably imagining every possible ending. Maybe Ohm would stop suddenly and block the highway. Maybe someone would get out. Maybe the driver would force them off the road. Maybe they were being led somewhere. Eventually, they approached a fork in the highway. One road led back toward the college town. The other continued deeper into the wooded area. This was where Tim expected something to happen. He probably thought Alm would take the road toward the college. Maybe the driver had been following them because he somehow knew where they were going. But when they reached the fork, Alm took the other road. The red compact car turned away from them and headed deeper into the darkness. Tim took the road toward the college. He and his friend watched the red car disappear. That was the last time Tim ever saw Alm. When Steve first told us this story during freshman year, I did not believe it. Not completely, anyway. It was creepy. But it also sounded exactly like the kind of story teenagers told each other because they wanted to scare their friends. Even Steve seemed unsure. He believed that his brother had experienced something strange, but he was not certain how accurate every detail was. Maybe Tim had exaggerated. Maybe his friend had exaggerated. Maybe years of retelling had changed the story. I basically filed Alm away in my head as a creepy story. Then, sometime around 2008 or 2009, something happened that made me rethink everything. I was living in suburban Orange County, California. That is important because it was about as far from some lonely road in New Hampshire as you could imagine. One day, I was sitting at home doing homework with the local talk radio station playing in the background. I was not paying much attention. The radio was simply noise while I worked. Then, a news bulletin came on. There had been a murder in a neighboring county the previous night. The police apparently had at least one witness. The witness had seen a vehicle leaving the area around the time of the crime. I kept working until the description of the vehicle came over the radio. It was a red compact car. That immediately caught my attention. Then, the report mentioned the license plate. According to the witness, it had a black O and a green M. I froze. For a few seconds, I honestly thought I had imagined it. There was no way. Steve had told me that story years earlier. His brother had supposedly seen this strange red car on a highway in New Hampshire. Now I was sitting thousands of miles away in California hearing a police report about a red compact car with the same strange license plate. A black O, a green M. I remember thinking that I had to be mistaken. Maybe the radio had said something else. Maybe my brain had connected the description to Steve's story because I already knew about Alm. Maybe I had misheard the report entirely. I spent the rest of the day feeling uneasy. Then I saw Steve at school. Before I could even fully explain what I had heard, I realized something from his reaction. He had heard it too. Steve had listened to the same report. We compared what we remembered. The details matched. A murder, a red compact car, a license plate with a black O and green M. Neither of us had imagined it. That changed the story for us. Until then, had been some weird story Steve's brother told. After hearing that radio report, the whole thing suddenly felt much more real. We learned two things that day. First, neither Steve nor I was crazy. Second, apparently existed. I tried to come up with logical explanations. Maybe there were two similar cars. Maybe the license plate had been misunderstood. Maybe the witness had described something that only sounded similar. Maybe Steve's brother had somehow heard about another case years earlier and incorporated parts of it into his story. There were plenty of possible explanations. But none of them made me feel much better. Then, years later, something else happened. This one involved my friend Blake. It happened during the month of May, long after I had first heard Tim's story. Blake knew about By then, the story had become one of those strange pieces of history among our friends. Most of us had heard it. Some believed it. Some thought it was just coincidence. Some probably thought the entire thing was nonsense. One night, around 2 in the morning, Blake was driving home after dropping off his girlfriend. For whatever reason, he decided to take a highway that passed through a canyon. Maybe it was faster. Maybe there was less traffic. Maybe he simply felt like taking that route. He drove into the canyon alone. It was late. The road was mostly empty. Then a car pulled in front of him. A red compact car. Blake immediately became uncomfortable. Then he saw the license plate. A black O. A green M. Because Blake already knew Tim's story and knew about the California murder report. He did not need time to understand why the car bothered him. He knew exactly what he thought he was looking at. Blake became terrified. He did not try to pass the car. He did not flash his lights. He did not challenge the driver. He simply dropped as far behind as possible. But according to Blake, would only allow him to fall back so far. The same behavior Tim had described years earlier happened again. If Blake created too much distance, the red car adjusted its speed. It remained ahead of him. Blake continued through the canyon with in front. I can only imagine what was going through his head. He already knew the stories. He knew about Tim. He knew about the murder report. Every mile must have felt like he was waiting for something terrible to happen. Then, near the end of the canyon, suddenly did something unexpected. The red compact car made a U-turn. It turned around and started heading back into the canyon. Blake continued driving home. He did not follow it. He did not stop. He did not try to get another look at the driver. He simply went home, probably more shaken than he wanted to admit. And that is basically everything I know about I have never personally seen the car. I have no photographs. I have no police records connecting the stories. I do not know who was driving. I do not even know whether refers to one person, several people, or simply some bizarre series of coincidences. My personal theory is that could be some kind of cross-country serial killer. The idea would be that the driver keeps moving from state to state, crossing jurisdiction lines and committing crimes in different places, so police departments never realize the cases are connected. That would at least explain how the same strange vehicle could appear in New Hampshire and later in California. But I have to be honest, that is only a theory. I cannot prove any of it. Maybe Tim's encounter had nothing to do with the California murder. Maybe Blake saw another car that looked similar. Maybe all of these stories became connected because our brains are extremely good at finding patterns, especially when we are already frightened. I would actually prefer that explanation, because the alternative means that sometime in the early morning hours, there may have been a red compact car traveling across America with its identifying marks removed, driven by someone who enjoyed finding people alone on dark roads. Someone who would pull in front of them, Slow down when they slowed down. Speed up when they sped up. Wait around corners. Keep exactly the right amount of distance. And then disappear into the darkness whenever the road finally split. I still think about Tim sitting on that highway with his friend. I think about those minutes when they had stopped before the curve, believing they were finally putting distance between themselves and Om. Then I imagine them starting the car again, slowly approaching that bend, hoping to see nothing ahead. And I imagine the moment their headlights crossed the road beyond the corner. The red car was still there, waiting exactly where it had been. That image has always stayed with me. The empty highway, the trees, the dead phone, the strange music on the radio. Two terrified college students inside their car, and those two markings glowing ahead of them in the darkness. A black O, a green M. I have told this story before, but even after all this time, it still creeps me out whenever I think about it. I have tried to explain it to myself in a lot of different ways over the years. Maybe I was half asleep. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. Maybe the darkness in my room made ordinary shapes look like something they were not. Those explanations sound reasonable when I am thinking about the experience during the day. But when I remember exactly how I felt that night, especially the feeling that something was staring at me with real hatred, all of those explanations become much harder to accept. The layout of my bedroom is important because of where this thing first appeared. Across the room from my bed, there was a small alcove built into one side of the room. It was not especially deep, and during the daytime there was nothing frightening about it. It was simply part of the shape of the room. The problem was that my closet stood slightly in front of it. Because of the position of the closet, the alcove received almost no light at night. When the ceiling light was on, the closet blocked much of the light from reaching that particular area. When the main light was off, the situation was even worse. Any weak light coming through the window from outside also had difficulty reaching the alcove because of the angle and the closet. So at night, that part of the bedroom became extremely dark. Not just shadowy, dark. It was darker than the rest of the room in a way that always made it noticeable. Even after my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could usually make out the general shapes of furniture, walls, and other objects. That corner was different. It remained almost completely black. Still, I had lived with it for a long time. I knew what my bedroom looked like. I knew where everything was. I knew the shape of the closet and the shape of the wall behind it. I had gone to sleep in that room hundreds of times without believing that anything was hiding in the alcove. That is part of what makes the experience so difficult for me to dismiss. At the time, I was in my 4th year of high school. It was an ordinary night as far as I can remember. Nothing dramatic had happened that day. I had not watched some terrifying horror movie immediately before going to bed. I was not sitting around trying to scare myself with ghost stories. I was simply trying to sleep. For some reason, I could not. Anyone who has spent a night lying awake knows how frustrating that can be. You close your eyes and expect sleep to come, but your mind refuses to switch off. You change positions. You pull the blanket higher. You turn onto one side, then the other. You tell yourself to stop thinking. Minutes seem much longer when you are lying in darkness, waiting to fall asleep. At first, that was all it was. I was awake. Then, I started getting that feeling. You probably know the one I mean. That strange sensation that someone is looking at you. It is hard to describe because there is usually nothing physical causing it. You do not necessarily hear anything. Nobody touches you. You might not even see anyone. You simply know, or at least feel, that someone is watching. Sometimes you get that feeling in public and turn around to discover that somebody really was staring at you from across the room. Other times, there's nobody there. This felt much stronger than that normal, uncomfortable sensation. I suddenly had the overwhelming impression that something inside my bedroom was watching me. I tried to ignore it. I was lying in my own bed, in my own room, in a familiar house. There was no reason to be frightened. But the feeling would not go away. The longer I lay there, the worse it became. It was not simply the feeling of being watched. It felt malicious. That is the best word I can use. Whatever I believed was staring at me did not feel curious. It did not feel neutral. It did not feel like someone had accidentally looked in my direction. The feeling was hostile. It felt as though whoever or whatever was watching me hated me. I know how dramatic that sounds. If someone told me the same story, I would probably wonder whether fear had changed their memory afterward. Maybe they saw something strange first, and then their brain created the feeling of danger. But that was not how I remember it. The feeling came first. Before I saw anything, I already felt that something was wrong. My eyes were closed, but I could not relax. I tried telling myself there was nothing there. I tried focusing on sleep. I tried ignoring that pressure in the room. Nothing worked. Eventually, I opened my eyes. Almost immediately, my attention went to the dark alcove across the bedroom. I did not slowly look around the room. My gaze seemed to go directly there. Even now, I cannot really explain why. It was as though some instinct inside me already knew exactly where I should look. The alcove was still almost completely dark. At first, I saw the usual blackness. Then I noticed something inside it. There was a shape. It was difficult to see clearly because the area was so dark, but there seemed to be a hazy outline standing there. The strange thing was that the outline appeared darker than the darkness around it. That sounds impossible, but that is honestly how I remember it. The alcove itself was black, yet there was something within that blackness that seemed even darker. It had a vague shape. I could not see a face. I could not see clothing. I could not make out detailed arms, hands, eyes, or anything else that would allow me to describe it as an ordinary person. It was more like the outline of something that should not have been there. The moment I noticed it, goosebumps spread across my skin. My body reacted before I could think logically about what I was seeing. Every part of me wanted to be afraid. But I tried very hard not to let myself panic. I told myself there was nothing in that corner. It was nighttime. The alcove was dark. My eyes were tired. When you stare into darkness long enough, your brain starts trying to create shapes from shadows. Maybe I was looking at the edge of the closet. Maybe clothes were hanging somewhere nearby. Maybe some normal object was creating an unusual shadow. There had to be an explanation. I had spent plenty of nights in that bedroom. Nothing had ever attacked me from the alcove before. So I did what people often do when they see something frightening at night. I closed my eyes. I basically decided that if I stopped looking at it, it would stop being frightening. I told myself I was imagining things. I tried forcing myself to sleep. But the feeling remained. Actually, it became worse. With my eyes closed, I could still feel that stare. I cannot properly explain how intense it was. Imagine lying completely still in darkness, while somehow knowing that someone is standing across the room watching you. Now imagine feeling that the person watching you wants to hurt you. That was what it felt like. My logical mind kept arguing with my fear. There is nothing there. You saw a shadow. You are tired. Go to sleep. But another part of my mind was screaming that I was not alone. I lay there, trying not to move. I do not know how much time passed. It may have only been seconds. It may have been several minutes. All I know is that I could not fall asleep. The feeling of being watched was too strong. Eventually, I opened my eyes again. That is when everything changed. The shadow was no longer in the alcove. It was beside my bed. I did not see it crossing the room. I did not hear footsteps. I did not hear the floor move. There was no sound that warned me something was approaching. One moment I had seen that dark outline across the bedroom. I closed my eyes. When I opened them again, it was right next to me. It was looming over the bed. The figure appeared bent forward, as though it were leaning down over me, and it was staring directly at me. I still could not see a normal face. There were no details I can clearly describe, but I knew it was looking at me. The distance between us was suddenly almost nothing. That was the moment every instinct inside me seemed to explode at once. People sometimes talk about fight or flight. This felt even more basic than that. My entire body reacted as though I was in immediate danger. There was no time to think about logical explanations. I did not wonder whether I was dreaming. I did not try to identify the shadow. I did not reach for a light. I did not get out of bed. I panicked. I grabbed my pillow and blanket and pulled them over my head. It was probably the most childish thing I could have done, but I did not care. At that moment, covering myself felt like the only protection available. I hid under the blanket. I did not look again. I was terrified of what I might see if I moved it. The idea of that thing still standing beside my bed was bad enough. The idea that it might have moved even closer was worse. I started crying. I stayed underneath the pillow and blanket, frightened and trying not to look outside. I do not know how I eventually managed to fall asleep. Maybe exhaustion finally took over. Maybe fear simply wore me down. I remember crying until sleep came. That was how the night ended. I woke up later, and of course there was no shadow figure standing next to me. The bedroom looked normal. The alcove across the room was just an alcove again. During daylight, it was easy to look at that corner and wonder how anything about it could have frightened me so badly. That is always one of the strangest parts about experiences like this. A room can feel completely different depending on the time of day. During daylight, you can look directly at the place where you believe something impossible was standing and almost laugh at yourself. There is the wall. There is the closet. There is the floor. Nothing else. But nighttime comes again. The room becomes dark, and suddenly, the memory feels much more believable. I have tried to convince myself that what I saw was some kind of sleep-related experience. Maybe I was drifting in and out of sleep without realizing it. People can experience strange things while falling asleep. They can see figures, hear sounds, or feel as though someone is in the room with them. That explanation makes sense. I understand that. Maybe the dark shape in the alcove was simply something normal that my tired brain misinterpreted. Maybe when I opened my eyes the second time, I was partly dreaming and imagined the figure beside the bed. I would honestly be happier believing that. The problem is the feeling. Even more than the shape itself, I remember the sense of malicious intent. I remember knowing something was staring at me before I saw it. And when I first saw the outline across the room, it seemed to confirm exactly what my body had already been warning me about. Then there was the way it changed positions. If I had simply seen a shadow standing beside my bed once, I could probably convince myself much more easily that it was a trick of the light. But I first saw it inside the dark alcove. I clearly remember that. I closed my eyes because I wanted it to disappear. Then I opened them again. It had crossed the entire room. There was no gradual movement. It was simply there, beside me, bent over me. Watching, that is the image I have never been able to completely forget. There were also other strange things in the house. Nothing as terrifying as what happened beside my bed, but enough to make the whole experience feel even more uncomfortable. Doors would slam shut. Normally, hearing a door slam in a house is not exactly paranormal. There are dozens of ordinary explanations. A window might be open. Wind can move through the house. Air pressure can change when another door opens or closes. Someone upstairs might shut a door harder than expected. But sometimes there did not seem to be any explanation. There would be no wind. Nobody would be upstairs. Then, suddenly, there would be the unmistakable sound of a door slamming. And sometimes the strangest part was that when we checked, no door seemed to have actually closed. That might sound like a small detail compared with seeing a shadow figure standing beside your bed, but it bothered me. A loud slam should have a source. You should be able to walk through the house and find the door that moved. When you cannot, your mind starts filling in possibilities. Maybe the sound came from somewhere else. Maybe something fell. Maybe the house itself made a noise that happened to sound exactly like a door. There is almost always some reasonable explanation available if you look hard enough. The problem is that after the bedroom experience, every unexplained noise felt different. A door slamming somewhere in the house was no longer simply a strange sound. It reminded me of that shadow. It reminded me of opening my eyes and seeing something in the alcove. It reminded me of closing them and then finding that same shape standing beside me. I do not claim to know what happened that night. I cannot tell you with complete certainty that there was a ghost in my bedroom. I cannot say it was a demon, spirit, shadow person, or anything else. I only know what I experienced. I was awake in bed and unable to sleep. I suddenly felt as though something was watching me. The feeling was so strong and so hostile that I could not ignore it. I opened my eyes. I looked toward the darkest corner of my room. Something seemed to be standing there. I tried convincing myself that it was my imagination. I closed my eyes. The feeling did not stop. Then, I opened them again. The thing was beside my bed. It was bent over me. It was staring down at me. And every instinct in my body told me that whatever I was looking at was not something I wanted near me. Even now, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had not hidden beneath the blanket. What if I had kept looking at it? Would it have disappeared once my eyes adjusted? Would I have realized it was just a harmless object creating a strange shadow? Would it have moved? Would I have seen a face? Those questions are probably better left unanswered. The possibility that it was all happening somewhere between sleep and wakefulness is comforting. That is the explanation I would prefer. But there is another thought that has always stayed in the back of my mind. What if I had not imagined it? What if that feeling of being watched was my body noticing something before my conscious mind understood what was happening? What if there really was something standing inside that dark alcove? Something that knew I had noticed it. Something that waited until I closed my eyes. And then crossed the room without making a sound. The most disturbing part is that I have no memory of it leaving. I never watched it disappear. I never saw it move back toward the alcove. I simply hid beneath my blanket, cried, and eventually fell asleep, while believing it was still standing beside me. For all I knew at the time, it remained there the entire night. Maybe it stayed beside the bed. Maybe it continued staring down at me after I fell asleep. Maybe there was nothing there at all. I honestly hope that last explanation is the truth. Because whenever I remember that room, I do not think first about the closet, or the bed, or the strange doors slamming elsewhere in the house. I think about that small alcove, I picture the darkness inside it. Then, I picture the hazy outline that seemed darker than everything around it. And finally, I remember opening my eyes for the second time and realizing that the corner was empty, because whatever had been standing there was now right beside me. I grew up in a very old house. It was built in 1856, and even when I was a kid, I always understood that the place had been standing long before anyone in my family had ever lived there. The age of the house was obvious in almost every part of it. The floors creaked. The walls seemed thicker than the ones in newer homes. Some of the doors never quite sat straight in their frames, and the wood around the windows had been painted and repainted so many times that you could almost see the history of the place in the layers. During the day, none of that bothered me. It was just home. At night, though, the house could feel completely different. Old houses make noise. Anyone who has lived in one knows that. Wood shifts, pipes knock, floors pop for no obvious reason. Wind can move through tiny gaps around windows and doors. Sometimes you hear something from another room and spend several seconds wondering whether it was a person before deciding it was probably just the house settling. I grew up around those sounds, so I was used to them. That is important. I did not normally jump at every little noise. The layout of the first floor also matters. The dining room had a huge window facing the front porch. It was one of those large old windows that gave you a wide view outside during the day, but at night it could become almost like a black mirror depending on the lighting inside. The porch wrapped around the house. It started across the front and continued along the side toward the kitchen door. Next to the dining room was the living room. From where we normally sat in the living room, you had an almost perfect view into the dining room and toward that giant front window. Because of that, if someone stood on the porch outside the dining room window, a person sitting in the living room would have a very good chance of seeing them. That is exactly what happened one night when I was home visiting from college. I do not remember anything unusual happening earlier that day. It was just a normal visit home. By then, I was used to being away at school, so coming back to the house always felt a little strange. Everything was familiar, but at the same time, I was no longer living there every day. My old bedroom was still there. The same rooms were in the same places. The same old sounds still came from the house at night. But I was a visitor now. That night, I stayed awake later than everyone else. I was sitting in the living room watching television. The house was quiet. My mother had already gone to sleep. My father and sister were somewhere else, so as far as I knew, I was the only person awake inside the house. The television was probably the loudest thing around. Outside, it was completely dark. Our property was fairly large, about 2.5 acres, and the house was not surrounded by city lights or constant traffic. At night, the darkness outside could become very deep, especially away from the porch and windows. I was relaxed. I had no reason not to be. Then I heard a sound. It was small, just a clicking noise. Nothing loud enough to make me immediately think someone was breaking into the house. It was simply noticeable enough to pull my attention away from the television. I turned my eyes toward the dining room, and that was when I saw him. There was a silhouette standing outside the dining room window. A man. A large man. He was standing on the front porch, facing into the house. For a second, my mind did not fully understand what I was looking at. Then the details started to register. The figure seemed tall and broad. He looked like he was wearing either a heavy flannel shirt or some kind of coat. On his head was what looked like a baseball cap. I could not see his face. I could not tell his age. I could not see his eyes. I only saw the dark shape of a large man standing directly outside the window, facing into the house, facing toward me. My heart felt like it was going to explode. There is a very specific kind of fear that comes from seeing a stranger standing outside your home at night. It is not the same as hearing a strange noise in the woods. It is not the same as watching a horror movie. Home is supposed to be the place where you are safe. There are walls around you. Doors are locked. Windows separate you from whatever is outside. Then suddenly, there is a human shape standing just beyond the glass, and you realize those walls are not as protective as they felt a few seconds earlier. My first instinct was to react, but I stopped myself. I did not jump up. I did not shout. I did not run toward the window. I barely moved at all. A thought went through my head immediately. If he was watching me, I did not want him to know that I had seen him. I did not know who he was. Maybe he was drunk. Maybe he was mentally unstable. Maybe he was looking for a way into the house. Maybe he had been standing there for several minutes before I noticed him. I had no idea. What frightened me most was that he was not knocking. He was not calling for help. He was not trying to get anyone's attention. He was simply standing at the window and looking inside. That made the situation feel much worse. If a normal person comes to your house in the middle of the night because they need something, they knock. They call out. They ring a doorbell if there is one. They do something to announce their presence. This person was doing none of that. He was just standing there. Watching, I kept myself as calm as possible. I did not want to turn my head too quickly. I did not want to stare directly at the window and make it obvious that I had noticed him. I slowly got up. I moved toward the stairs. Every step felt strange because I was trying to act normal while my entire body was screaming at me to run. I could still feel the presence of that figure behind me. I did not know whether he was following my movement through the glass. I did not know whether he was reaching for a door. I did not know whether there was someone else outside with him. All I knew was that I needed to get upstairs. The moment I reached the stairs and felt that I was no longer in direct view of the dining room window, I ran. I sprinted upstairs to my bedroom. At that point, fear turned into action. I grabbed my Marlin 336C rifle. I loaded it. I also grabbed my uncle's combat knife, the same knife he had used during Vietnam. I remember the weight of those objects, making the situation feel suddenly much more real. A few moments earlier, I had been sitting on a couch watching television. Now I was upstairs loading a rifle because there was a stranger standing outside the house. I had no idea what was waiting downstairs. I did not know whether the man had moved. I did not know whether he had entered the house. I did not know whether he had seen me run. I listened carefully. The house was quiet. I could hear my own breathing. The adrenaline was making everything feel sharper. Every tiny sound seemed important. I started back downstairs. I moved carefully. I did not want to accidentally wake my mother and terrify her, but I also knew that if someone had entered the house, I needed to be ready. As I came down, I began switching on lights. I wanted the entire first floor lit. If someone was inside, I wanted to see him. If someone was outside, I wanted him to know the house was awake. The dark rooms filled with light, one after another. The living room, the dining room, the kitchen. I looked toward the giant dining room window. The silhouette was gone. That should have made me feel better. It did not. Now I had no idea where he was. A man standing still outside a window is terrifying. A man who is standing outside a window and then disappeared is worse. I moved toward the kitchen. The kitchen door opened onto the side of the wraparound porch. I had already decided that I was going outside. Looking back, I know people will have different opinions about whether that was a smart decision. At the time, however, all I could think about was protecting the house and finding out who was out there. I did not want to sit inside wondering whether the man was trying another window. I did not want him moving around the property while my mother slept upstairs. So I opened the kitchen door and went out. As I stepped onto the porch, I worked the action on the rifle. The sound seemed incredibly loud in the silence. I held the weapon ready. I did not scream. I did not start making threats. I spoke firmly, but kept my voice controlled. I have a gun. Come out, and I won't shoot you. For a moment, there was silence. I listened. Then I heard footsteps. 2 of them. 2 clear footsteps on the wooden porch. That sound erased any remaining doubt I had that someone had been outside. The porch was old wood. Footsteps on it had a very recognizable sound. These were not branches falling. They were not leaves blowing across the yard. They were footsteps. Someone was moving. The sound seemed to come from the direction of the front porch. I swung around quickly. I was completely prepared to see someone there. My body was ready for a confrontation. My heart was pounding. I expected that large figure to be standing around the corner. Maybe he would be running away. Maybe he would be coming toward me. Maybe he would have a weapon. I had no idea. I rounded the porch. There was nothing there. No man, no movement, no footsteps continuing away. Nothing. The front porch was empty. I looked toward the yard. Nothing moved. I checked near the window where I had seen the figure. No one. I moved farther around the porch. Still nothing. That confused me almost as much as it scared me. I had heard 2 footsteps. They had sounded close. There should have been someone there. A man large enough for me to clearly see his silhouette through the dining room window should not have been able to simply disappear within a second or 2. I started searching. Our property covered about 2.5 acres, so there were plenty of places where someone could potentially hide. Trees, dark areas near the edges of the property, places around the house. Anything that cast a large enough shadow became suspicious. I spent around an hour looking. I checked around the house first. I looked behind anything large enough to hide a person. I searched near the porch. I looked around the yard. I kept listening for movement. Every sound made me stop. The darkness outside felt much larger than usual. When you are searching for someone at night, your imagination starts working against you. Every tree can look like a person. Every shadow can seem like it moved. You look toward one part of the property and feel certain someone is standing there, only to realize it is a branch or fence post. Then you look away and immediately wonder whether that was exactly what someone hiding would want you to do. I searched and searched. There was no one. I did not see anyone running away. I did not find anyone hiding. I did not find a vehicle. I did not find anything that explained the silhouette. Eventually, I went back inside. By then, the adrenaline had started turning into something worse. Questions: who had I seen? Why had he been standing at the window? How long had he been there before I noticed him? Had he been looking specifically at me? Had he been checking the house? Had he known that only one person was awake? Had he left when I went upstairs? And where had those footsteps come from? Those 2 footsteps bothered me more and more. If the person had run, I should have heard more than 2. If he had jumped off the porch, I probably would have heard that. If he had hidden nearby, I should have had at least some chance of finding him during an hour of searching. But there was nothing. I also kept thinking about that clicking sound. That was what first made me look toward the window. I never figured out what caused it. Maybe it was something ordinary. Maybe the person had touched the window. Maybe something on the porch moved. Maybe it came from somewhere inside the house and had nothing to do with the figure. I do not know. What I know is that I heard it looked toward the dining room, and saw a large man standing outside. For the next several nights, I barely slept. Actually, I did not really sleep properly for the entire week. Every time the house made a sound, I woke up. Every creak became a possible footstep. Every click made me look toward a window. I kept imagining that silhouette appearing again. There is something especially disturbing about large windows at night after an experience like that. During the day, windows connect you to the outside. At night, when the inside of the house is lit, they can make you feel exposed. You realize that you cannot always see what is outside. But anyone standing in the darkness can see you perfectly. They can watch you sitting on a couch. They can see which lights are on. They can see when you stand up. They can see when you leave the room. For a long time after that night, I hated the idea of someone standing outside that dining room window. Sometimes I would walk through the room after dark and deliberately avoid looking toward the glass. Other times I would force myself to look. Most nights there was nothing there. Just darkness. That should have helped. But it never completely erased the memory. I still remember the exact outline. The broad shoulders. The flannel or coat. The baseball cap. The way he stood completely still. There is one part of the experience that I keep returning to. He did not react when I first saw him. At least, not that I noticed. He did not duck. He did not run. He did not move away from the glass. He simply stood there. That made me wonder whether he knew I had seen him. I had tried not to show any reaction, but maybe he noticed anyway. Maybe he watched me get up. Maybe he watched me walk toward the stairs. Maybe he knew exactly what I was doing when I disappeared from view. That thought makes what happened next even stranger. If he was a normal person with bad intentions, why stay on the porch long enough for me to come back downstairs armed? Why make only 2 footsteps after I announced that I had a gun? Why not run? Why not say something? And how did he disappear so quickly? There are possible explanations. Maybe he knew the property better than I realized. Maybe there was some dark spot close to the porch where he hid while I searched. Maybe he ran through a section of the yard I could not see. Maybe he was simply faster and quieter than I expected. Maybe the footsteps were unrelated. I have considered all of that. I would much rather believe I saw an actual trespasser than something stranger. A trespasser is terrifying, but at least it makes sense. A man can stand outside a window. A man can watch a house. A man can run away. A man can hide. All of that exists in the normal world. But there is another possibility that I do not like thinking about. The house was built in 1856. That does not automatically mean anything supernatural happened there. Old houses are just old houses. People sometimes treat age itself as proof that a place must be haunted, and I do not believe that. Still, when you grow up in a house that has existed for that long, it is impossible not to occasionally think about all the people who were there before you. Generations lived and died while that house remained standing. Different families looked out those same windows. Different people walked across that porch. Different footsteps crossed those wooden boards. I have no idea who stood outside my dining room window that night. Maybe it was a living person. Maybe someone had wandered onto the property for reasons I will never understand. Maybe he left the moment I ran upstairs and I simply failed to find him. That is the explanation I usually choose. It is easier. But every time I tell the story, I reach the same point and feel uneasy again. I remember opening the kitchen door with the rifle in my hands. I remember stepping onto the porch. I remember telling whoever was out there that I had a gun. Then I remember the answer. 2 footsteps. Clear, heavy enough to sound like someone was standing only a short distance away. I turned toward them immediately. There was nobody there. Not someone running. Not someone hiding behind the corner. Not a shadow disappearing into the yard. Nothing, just the empty wooden porch of a house built more than a century before I was born. I searched 2.5 acres for nearly an hour and never found any sign of the man I had seen standing at the window. I never found out who he was. I never learned why he had been watching the house. I never heard anything about a stranger being caught nearby. As far as I know, there was no explanation. Maybe that is why the memory has stayed with me. The encounter never had an ending. There was no moment when police found a trespasser and told us who he was. There was no neighbor who later admitted that they had walked onto the wrong property. There was no simple explanation that allowed me to laugh about it later. There was just a silhouette, a large man in what looked like flannel or a coat, a baseball cap, a face I could not see, a dark window, 2 footsteps on an empty porch, and then nothing. For the entire week afterward, sleep felt impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that giant dining room window. I imagined opening my eyes in the living room and seeing him there again. Sometimes, in my imagination, he was farther away. Sometimes he was closer to the glass. Sometimes I imagined that while I had been upstairs grabbing the rifle, he had moved around the porch and tried the kitchen door. I wondered what would have happened if I had not heard that small clicking noise. Would I ever have noticed him? Would he have continued standing there watching me? Would he eventually have walked away? Or was he waiting for something? Those thoughts kept me awake night after night. Even now, when I think about that house, I can still picture the view from the living room into the dining room. I can see the window. I can see the darkness outside. And in the center of it, I can still see that man-shaped silhouette standing silently on the porch. Maybe he was just a stranger. Maybe he had some reason for being there that I will never know. Maybe there is nothing mysterious about what happened at all. But I know what I saw. And I know what I heard. I saw a large man standing outside the window, staring into the house while I sat alone watching television. I went upstairs, armed myself, came back down, and stepped outside. I warned him that I had a gun. Something took 2 steps on the porch. I turned, and there was no one there. I searched for an hour. I never found him. And for the rest of that week, I could not sleep without wondering whether he was still somewhere outside, standing just beyond one of those old windows, waiting for me to look again. This happened to my mother's uncle sometime in the 1970s in India. When my mother first told me the story, I honestly did not believe it. I thought it was probably one of those old family stories that had been repeated so many times that the details had become more dramatic with every retelling. Families have stories like that. Someone hears something strange, someone else adds a detail, and decades later it becomes something almost supernatural. That was what I assumed had happened here. For most of my life, I treated it as an unsettling story and nothing more. Then, about a year before my mother's uncle passed away, I met him myself. After that, I stopped being so certain. I will call him Unc, because it is easier. Unc lived in a rural Indian village. This was decades ago, and life there was very different from what many people are used to now. Electricity existed, but it was unreliable. Power could disappear without warning, and once the sun went down, large parts of the village became almost completely dark. There were no bright streetlights covering every road. There were no glowing stores open all night. There were no phones in everyone's pockets with flashlights built into them. When darkness came, it was real darkness. Inside the village, people still had lamps, candles, and whatever other sources of light they could use. But once you left the homes behind and traveled between villages, the night could become extremely deep. The roads were often narrow and quiet, Fields stretched away into darkness. Trees and bushes became black shapes along the sides of the path. If there was no moon, you could sometimes see very little beyond what was directly in front of you. People who lived there were used to it. They had to be. They traveled those roads for work, family, business, and daily life. Unc was one of those people. From everything I have been told, he had been a very intelligent and capable man. He worked as an accountant. He was sharp with numbers, dependable, and respected by the people who knew him. He had clients in different villages, which meant he often had to travel a long distance to meet them. He usually made those trips by bicycle. That sounds simple now, but some of the journeys were not short. He would ride along rural paths and roads, sometimes for a considerable distance, conduct his business, and then return home. He knew the area. He knew the roads. He was not someone who frightened easily just because it became dark. That is another reason the story has always bothered my family. The man who left home that day was apparently a confident, intelligent person. The man who came back was not the same. One evening, Ung Si had traveled to a neighboring village to meet someone for work. I do not know exactly how late he stayed, but by the time he began riding home, the sun had already gone down. The road back was particularly dark. It was also lonely. There were sections where there were no houses nearby and almost no reason for anyone to be walking around at that hour. Unk was riding by himself. I sometimes try to imagine what that must have felt like. The sound of the bicycle chain, the wheels rolling over the road, the small noises from the countryside at night. Maybe insects, maybe leaves moving somewhere beyond the path, maybe distant dogs. Then long periods where there was almost nothing at all. If you have spent time in a rural place at night, you know how different silence can feel there. In a city, even late at night, there is almost always some background noise. A car, a distant engine, a building, people somewhere. On an isolated country road, silence can make you feel as though you are the only person awake for miles. Unsi continued riding. He had probably traveled that way many times before. There was no reason to believe that this particular journey would be any different. Then, he heard a voice behind him. Someone was calling to him. At first, that alone must have been strange. As far as he knew, there was nobody else on the road. He had not seen anyone walking behind him. No bicycle had approached. No cart had followed. There had been no sound of footsteps. Yet the voice came from behind, and it was calling to him directly. Then he recognized it. That was when the real fear began. The voice sounded like his daughter, not similar to her, not like some random child whose voice reminded him of her. According to the story, he knew the voice. It was his daughter calling him. There was one impossible problem. His daughter was dead. She had died when she was only 5 years old. I do not know how long before that night she had passed away, and I do not know all the circumstances of her death. Those details were never the focus of the story. What mattered was that Unk knew she could not possibly be behind him. He knew she was gone. Yet on that dark road, far from home, he heard her voice, calling to him. I cannot imagine what that would do to a parent. There are some voices a person could probably recognize anywhere. A child's voice would be one of them, especially the voice of a child you had lost. Maybe that was exactly why it was so powerful. Whatever Unk believed was happening, he became terrified. He started pedaling faster. He did not turn around, at least not at first. He kept his eyes forward and tried to put distance between himself and the voice. The bicycle moved faster along the dark road. But the voice continued. His daughter was still calling him from behind. There was a reason he was especially frightened. There was an old warning he knew. It is the kind of superstition that exists in different forms in many places, but the version my family knew was simple. If you are alone on a dark, isolated road at night and hear the voice of someone you know calling you from behind, especially someone who should not be there, you do not turn around. You keep walking or riding. You do not answer. You do not look. The belief is that what you are hearing may not actually be the person whose voice it is using. It may be something else trying to get your attention. Something malicious. Something that wants you to acknowledge it. Stories warn that such entities imitate the voices of relatives, friends, or people you trust, because those are the voices most likely to make you turn around. The warning is not complicated. No matter what you hear, keep going. Do not look back. Ankh knew that warning. Maybe he had heard it since childhood. Maybe he had laughed at it before. I do not know. But on that road, with his dead daughter calling to him from somewhere behind the bicycle, it suddenly did not feel like an old superstition. It felt real. He kept riding. He tried to ignore the voice. But imagine the conflict inside him. Part of his mind must have known it was impossible. His daughter was dead. Whatever was behind him could not be her. But another part of him was hearing his child. Maybe the voice sounded frightened. Maybe it sounded normal. Maybe it called him in exactly the way she had when she was alive. I do not know, because he never explained it. That missing information makes the story worse for me. We know he heard her. We know he became frightened. We know he understood that he was not supposed to look back. And we know that eventually, for some reason, he did. Maybe curiosity became too strong. Maybe the voice sounded so convincing that emotion overpowered fear. Maybe he thought there really was someone behind him. Maybe he wanted to prove to himself that the entire thing was only his imagination. Maybe he simply reacted before he could stop himself. Whatever the reason, Unsi turned around. He looked behind him. Nobody in my family knows exactly what he saw. That is the part he took with him. He made it home that night. Physically, he survived. He was not found dead on the road. He did not disappear. He did not crash his bicycle and wake up days later. He returned to his village. But according to my mother and other relatives, something about him had changed. Deeply, permanently, they said he was never the same person again. Before that night, he had been intelligent, focused, and respected. He could work with money and numbers. He dealt with clients. He managed his responsibilities. Afterward, his mental state became badly disturbed. He became withdrawn. He mumbled to himself. He seemed disconnected from the person he had once been. His ability to function normally was never the same. The family tried to understand what had happened. I am sure people had different explanations. Some probably believed he had seen something supernatural. Some may have believed the fear itself had caused some kind of mental breakdown. Maybe something else happened on the road that he never told anyone. Maybe he saw an ordinary person and experienced such a powerful shock that his mind could not process it. There are rational explanations that could be suggested. A medical problem, a neurological event, a psychological crisis, extreme grief connected to the loss of his daughter, a traumatic experience unrelated to anything supernatural. All of those are possible. I am not saying they are not. I was not there. Neither was my mother. This happened decades ago. There is no recording. There are no photographs. There is no medical report I can show anyone that proves a ghost or demon was involved. All we have is what happened before and after. Before that ride, he was one kind of man. After that ride, he was someone else. The family knew that something had happened to him on the road. They knew about the voice. They knew he had looked back. But he refused to explain what he had seen. People asked him. Relatives tried. He would not say. That refusal is one of the things that disturbed me even before I met him. If it had simply been an animal on the road, why not say that? If it had been another person, why not explain? If it had been nothing at all, why refuse to speak about it? Maybe he was embarrassed. Maybe he knew his mind had played a trick on him and did not want to admit it. Maybe the memory was simply too painful because the voice belonged to his dead daughter. There are plenty of human reasons someone might refuse to talk about a traumatic event. Still, the family could never get an answer. He never told them what was behind him. Years passed. Then, decades. The story stayed in the family. By the time I first heard it, it sounded almost like folklore. A man riding through darkness. The voice of his dead child calling from behind. The old warning not to look. The moment he turns around. Then, a permanent change. It sounded too perfect as a scary story. That was exactly why I doubted it. Stories become cleaner when they are retold. Real life is usually messy. But this story had all the pieces of a traditional warning tale. A dark road, a dead loved one, a forbidden action, a terrible consequence. I assumed that even if something had happened, the supernatural parts had probably been added later. Then I met Unc. It happened about a year before he died. By then, I already knew the story. I knew what I had been told about him. I knew the person sitting in front of me was supposed to be the same man who had once been a respected accountant. I also knew I wanted to ask him about that night. Part of me hoped he would laugh. I hoped he would say the whole thing had been exaggerated. Maybe he would tell me that he had heard an animal become frightened and the family had turned it into a ghost story. Maybe he would say there had never been any voice. Maybe he would finally give me an ordinary explanation. Instead, meeting him made me more uncomfortable. He was an old man by then. Years of whatever had happened to him had taken their toll. What struck me most were his eyes. I still have difficulty explaining the look. There was something about them that immediately unsettled me. It was not simply sadness. It was not normal confusion. He looked like someone who had carried something terrible inside himself for a very long time. That may only be my interpretation. I already knew the story before I met him, so maybe I saw what I expected to see. I understand that possibility. But standing there in front of him, I suddenly found it much harder to dismiss what my mother had told me. This was not just some faceless character in an old family story. This was a real person. I could look at him. I could see what remained of the man everyone had described, and there was something deeply unsettling about him. I tried asking about the incident. It would not tell me. I wanted to know what he had seen when he looked behind him. That was the only question that really mattered. Did he see his daughter? Did he see someone else? Did he see some strange figure standing in the road? Was there nothing behind him at all? He refused to explain. I never got an answer. Nobody did. He died about a year later. Whatever he saw on that road died with him. That is probably what bothers me most. Had he eventually described it, maybe the story would feel less frightening. No matter what the answer was, at least there would be an answer. Instead, there is an empty space exactly where the worst part should be. He heard the voice. He turned. He saw something. And then he refused to speak about it for the rest of his life. Sometimes what is missing from a story is more frightening than anything you could add. I have thought about what he might have seen. Maybe he saw his daughter standing in the road exactly as she had looked when she was alive. That alone would have been terrifying. Imagine losing a 5-year-old child, grieving her death, and then years later, seeing her standing alone on a dark country road at night. Maybe she smiled at him. Maybe she looked angry. Maybe she looked exactly as he remembered. Or maybe what he saw was not really her. Maybe something had copied her voice, but could not copy her appearance. That is the idea behind the old warning, after all. The voice is supposed to make you turn around. The voice is bait. Once you look, you see what was actually calling you. I do not know whether I believe that, but I understand why the idea has frightened people for generations. Human beings are vulnerable to familiar voices. If a stranger called your name from behind on a dark road, you might keep going. If your dead child called you, the temptation to turn around would be almost impossible to resist. There are other possibilities. Maybe nothing supernatural happened. Perhaps Unc had already been struggling with grief. Maybe hearing something that reminded him of his daughter triggered a breakdown. Maybe exhaustion, darkness, and fear caused him to hallucinate. Maybe he suffered a medical event while riding. If this happened today, perhaps doctors could examine him and offer some explanation. But this was a rural village in India in the 1970s. The situation was different. Mental health problems were not always understood or treated the way they might be now. Neurological conditions could go undiagnosed. Families often explained unusual behavior through religion, superstition, tradition, or whatever knowledge they had available. So I cannot confidently say what happened. I only know the story my family tells. And I know what I saw when I finally met the man at the center of it. That encounter changed the way I thought about everything. Before, I imagined the story as entertainment. Afterward, I imagined the road. I pictured a younger version of Unc, riding his bicycle through almost total darkness. I imagined the small circle of visibility in front of him and miles of black countryside beyond it. I imagined him hearing his name. Then, hearing his daughter. Maybe at first he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. Then, the voice came again. Closer, clearer. He knew she was dead. He knew the warning. Do not look back. Whatever happens, do not look back. So he pedaled faster. The chain turned. His legs burned. The road continued into darkness, and behind him, a little girl who had been dead for years kept calling. I think about the moment just before he turned his head. That must have been the last moment of his life before everything changed. He still had a choice. Keep looking forward and ride home. Or look behind him. For whatever reason, he looked. I wonder if he regretted that decision immediately. I wonder if the thing he saw was standing right behind the bicycle. I wonder if it was farther down the road. I wonder whether it looked human. I wonder whether it looked like his daughter. I wonder whether it was something his mind could not understand. And I wonder whether the reason he never described it was because there were simply no words for what he had seen. Maybe he was ashamed. Maybe he was traumatized. Maybe he had forgotten parts of the event. Or maybe he remembered every detail perfectly and spent the rest of his life trying not to think about it. The only person who knew would not speak. That is how it remained until he died. I still do not know whether I believe in the supernatural explanation completely. Meeting him did not give me proof. It did not suddenly make ghosts or demons objectively real, but it destroyed the comfortable distance I had from the story. It was easy to dismiss the tale when Unc was just a name. It became much harder when I stood in front of him, when I saw his face, when I saw those eyes, when I realized that this man had carried the memory of that night for decades and still refused to tell anyone what he saw. There was fear in those eyes, or at least something I understood as fear, old fear, the kind that had been there for a very long time. Even now, thinking about it gives me chills. Not because I know what happened, because I do not. Maybe the old superstition is only a superstition. Maybe there is nothing waiting on lonely roads at night. Maybe voices are only memories, animals, echoes, or the mind playing tricks when someone is tired and alone. But whenever I hear stories about people hearing familiar voices from somewhere they should not be, I think about Unk. I think about a dark road in rural India in the 1970s. I think about a respected accountant riding home after work. I think about the voice of his 5-year-old daughter coming from behind him, even though she had already died. I think about the warning he knew. Do not answer. Do not stop. Do not turn around. Then I remember that he did turn around. He saw something. He survived long enough to return home. But according to everyone who knew him, the man who came back was not the man who had left. And decades later, when I finally stood in front of him and asked what he had seen, he still would not tell me. The look in his eyes that day has stayed with me ever since. Whatever happened on that road, I do not think he ever truly left it behind. I suffer from sleep paralysis from time to time, and because of that, I know that hallucinations can happen when a person wakes up but cannot move yet. I understand the basic explanation. Your mind wakes before your body fully does, and sometimes your brain creates sounds, shapes, or people that are not really there. Knowing that should make the experience less frightening. It does not. The worst part is that whenever I have sleep paralysis, I do not see something random. I always see the same thing, every single time. The experience usually begins slowly. At first, I do not even realize I am awake. I feel myself coming out of sleep, but something about the room feels wrong before I fully understand what is happening. Then I hear whispering. It seems to come from everywhere. Sometimes it sounds like it is close to my ears. Other times it feels like several people are standing around the room talking quietly at the same time. I can never understand what they are saying. There are no clear sentences, no words I can remember afterward. It is just constant whispering, soft at first, low, busy, like a crowd of people trying to speak quietly enough that I cannot understand them. As I become more awake, I realize I cannot move. That is usually the moment when the fear really starts. I know what is happening. Sleep paralysis. Again, I try moving my fingers. Nothing, I try moving my legs. Nothing, I try turning my head. Nothing happens. My body feels completely disconnected from me. My mind is awake, but everything below my thoughts still feels asleep. Then I notice the pressure on my chest. It starts like a weight. Not exactly pain, but enough pressure that it becomes difficult to ignore. It feels as if someone is pressing down on me. Sometimes I can still breathe, but every breath feels harder because of the weight. My chest feels trapped, pinned, and because I cannot move, I cannot push whatever I imagine is there away. That helplessness is one of the worst parts. If I woke up from a nightmare and saw something standing beside my bed, at least I could sit up. I could turn on a light. I could run. During sleep paralysis, I cannot do any of those things. I am completely stuck. All I can do is lie there and wait. By now, I usually already know what I am going to see. That makes opening my eyes difficult. But for some reason, I usually do it anyway. Maybe part of me hopes that this time will be different. Maybe I will open my eyes and see nothing. Maybe I will prove to myself that the girl is not there. But every time I open my eyes, she is there. A little girl is sitting on my chest. She appears to be young, though I have never been able to guess her exact age. She wears an old-fashioned white lace dress. It is not the kind of clothing you normally see a child wearing today. It looks old. The dress has a strange antique quality to it, almost like something from a photograph taken many decades ago. Her hair is long and black, very black. It falls down her back. The first thing I always see is the back of her head because she is sitting with her back facing me. That means I never see her face immediately. In some ways, I think that makes it worse. If she simply appeared facing me, maybe I would already know what she looked like. Instead, the fear builds. She sits there. Still, her weight seems to be exactly where the pressure on my chest is coming from. The whispering continues around us. I cannot move. I cannot speak. I cannot reach out and push her away. I just stare at the back of this little girl sitting on me. I know she is not real. At least I tell myself she is not real. I know sleep paralysis can cause hallucinations. I know the human brain can create incredibly realistic images during that state. But knowledge does not matter much when you are trapped in bed and a child in an old white dress is sitting on your chest. She looks real. The pressure feels real. The whispers sound real. And worst of all, she always does the same thing. She starts turning her head. Slowly, she does not turn her whole body. She remains sitting with her back toward me. Only her head begins to move. It turns gradually over her shoulder, toward me. Even remembering it makes me uncomfortable because there is something deeply wrong about the movement. It is slow enough that I have plenty of time to understand what is happening. She is trying to look at me. Or maybe she already knows I am awake and wants me to see her. The moment she starts turning her head, the whispering becomes louder. Not suddenly. It grows. A little louder. Then, louder again. The voices seem to surround me. There are more of them. Or maybe they are simply moving closer. I still cannot make out what they are saying. That might be one of the strangest details. No matter how loud they become, the words remain impossible to understand. It is as though language itself is breaking apart. I hear voices. I know they are voices. But the meaning never reaches me. The girl keeps turning. And I know that if I keep my eyes open, eventually I will see her face. I have never let that happen. Not once. I always close my eyes before she finishes turning around, every time. Maybe that sounds strange. After experiencing this more than a dozen times, you would think curiosity would eventually become stronger than fear. Part of me is curious. I have wondered what her face looks like. Is she normal? Is she smiling? Does she have eyes? Does she look dead? Does she look like someone I know? I have imagined all kinds of possibilities after waking. But when the paralysis is actually happening, curiosity disappears. The only thing I feel is fear. I do not want to see her face. Something inside me is completely certain that seeing it would be worse than anything else. So I close my eyes. That does not make her disappear. The pressure on my chest becomes heavier. It feels like she is pressing down harder, maybe leaning closer, maybe shifting her weight. I cannot see what she is doing because my eyes are shut, but I can still feel her. The whispers continue getting louder. They rise until they are almost unbearable. What began as quiet voices around the room becomes something close to deafening. It feels like hundreds of people are whispering at the same time, directly around my head. I cannot block it out. I cannot cover my ears. I cannot move. I can only lie there with my eyes squeezed shut while the pressure increases and the whispers become louder. I always wonder whether she has finished turning her head. Is she looking at me now? Is her face inches away from mine? I do not know. I refuse to open my eyes to find out. Then everything stops. Completely. The whispering disappears. The pressure disappears. There is silence, not gradual silence. One moment the room is filled with overwhelming whispering, and the next there is nothing. That silence is almost as frightening as the noise, maybe worse, because I do not know whether the experience has actually ended. I do not know whether the girl is gone. All I know is that I cannot hear anything anymore. Then my body slowly begins coming back under my control. Usually it starts with something small. A finger, my hand, my toes. I realize I can move again. The paralysis begins to break. My breathing becomes easier. I can finally shift my body. At that point, I know I have reached the end of the episode. But I still do not open my eyes. I never do. I cannot bring myself to look. Logically, I know what I should do. Open my eyes, sit up, turn on the light, look around the room, prove that nothing is there. But I cannot. There is always one thought stopping me. What if she is still sitting there? What if the sleep paralysis has ended, but she has not disappeared? What if I open my eyes and finally see the face I have spent all these years avoiding? So instead, I keep my eyes closed. Once I can move, I usually turn away or pull the blanket around myself. Then I force myself to go back to sleep. That might sound impossible after something so frightening, but I would rather fall asleep again than open my eyes and risk seeing her. It has happened to me more than a dozen times. At this point, I have lost count. It happens roughly once a month. Sometimes there is a longer gap. Sometimes I start thinking maybe it has finally stopped. Then, one night I wake up and hear those whispers again. The moment I hear them, I know exactly what is coming. That might be the worst part now. The first time it happened, I had no idea what I was experiencing. Now I do. There is no confusion anymore. There is only anticipation. The whispers begin. I realize I cannot move. The pressure appears on my chest, and before I even open my eyes, I already know she is there. The same girl, the same white lace dress, the same long black hair, the same position. Back facing me, waiting, then she starts turning. Every time, never faster, never slower, just the same awful movement. I have spent a lot of time wondering why my brain always creates the same hallucination. From what I understand, sleep paralysis hallucinations can vary. People see shadow figures. Strangers, animals, faces, things standing in doorways. Sometimes they hear footsteps or voices. Sometimes they feel someone touching them. But my experience is strangely consistent. It is always her. That bothers me. If the hallucination changed every time, it would be easier for me to believe it was simply random activity from my sleeping brain. One month, I might see a shadow. Another month, a stranger. Another time, nothing at all. Instead, I get the same visitor. It feels almost rehearsed. The same beginning, the same sounds, the same pressure, the same girl. The same slow turn, the same ending. It happens in the same order so often that I can almost predict each moment while I am trapped inside it. Sometimes I wonder whether expecting her is exactly why she returns. Maybe after the first episode, my brain created a pattern. Now, whenever sleep paralysis starts, I remember the girl, and because I expect to see her, my mind produces her again. That makes sense. It is probably the most reasonable explanation. Fear can reinforce itself. Once your brain associates something with danger, it becomes easier to imagine that same thing again. Maybe I created my own recurring nightmare without meaning to. I hope that is all it is. But it still does not explain how real everything feels. The pressure is physical. The voices surround me. The girl's body seems solid. Her hair has shape. Her dress has detail. It is not like remembering an image from a dream. It feels like waking up and discovering someone in the room. And because I am unable to move, I cannot test whether she is really there. I cannot reach out. I cannot touch her. I cannot roll away. I cannot even shout. That makes the hallucination feel powerful. It controls the entire experience. Sometimes, after I wake properly the next morning, I stay in bed thinking about it. I look at the place where she was sitting. Nothing is there. Of course, there is no little girl, no white dress, no long black hair. The room looks normal. Morning light makes everything seem harmless. I can move freely. I can sit up. I can walk around. I can tell myself it was only sleep paralysis. Then nighttime comes again. The room becomes dark, and I remember exactly what it felt like. I sometimes wonder whether one day I will finally keep my eyes open. I have thought about preparing myself. I tell myself that next time it happens, I will watch her turn around. I will force myself to look. Maybe seeing her face will actually make the hallucination less powerful. Maybe it will be something obviously impossible, and I will realize that my brain is creating everything. Maybe her face will look normal. Maybe there is nothing to fear. I can make those promises easily when I am awake. Then the episode begins. The whispers surround me. The weight presses on my chest. I open my eyes. There she is. All that courage disappears. The moment her head starts turning, I close my eyes again. I have never seen her face. After more than a dozen encounters, I still have no idea what she looks like from the front. Part of me thinks that is for the best. Another part of me wonders whether that uncertainty is exactly what keeps the fear alive. Because my imagination can create something much worse than any actual face. When I think about her, I sometimes try to picture what is happening from another angle. Imagine someone standing in the room, watching me sleep. They would see me lying still. Then, maybe my eyes would open. They would see nothing else. No girl. No movement. No reason for me to be terrified. Inside my own mind, however, the room would be filled with voices. A child would be sitting on my chest. She would slowly be turning around. My body would be completely frozen. It is strange how two completely different realities can exist in the same moment. From the outside, I am just asleep. Inside, I am trapped. That helplessness has changed the way I think about sleep. Most nights, going to bed is normal. I do not spend every evening terrified. But sometimes, especially if I am exhausted or my sleep schedule has been strange, I think about the possibility that it might happen again. I lie down and wonder whether tonight will be one of those nights. Sometimes I wake naturally in the middle of the night and immediately test whether I can move. A finger, a foot, anything. The second I know I can move, I relax. But if I wake and feel even slightly heavy, panic starts quickly. I listen. Are there whispers? Is there pressure? Is she coming? The strange thing is that I know this is a real medical sleep phenomenon. People experience sleep paralysis all over the world. The feeling of pressure on the chest is common. Hallucinations are common. The sense that someone is in the room is common. Knowing that gives me some comfort. It means I am not alone. It means there is a scientific explanation. But the repeated image of the same little girl still gets to me. Why her? Why that dress? Why the long black hair? Why is she always facing away at first? Why does she always turn her head? Why does the whispering become louder while she does it? I do not remember dreaming about anyone like her before the first episode. I cannot think of a movie character who looks exactly like her. I do not remember knowing a child who dressed that way. She just appeared. And then she kept coming back. There is another detail that has always disturbed me. She never seems surprised that I wake up. She is already there, sitting on me, almost as though she has been waiting for me to become conscious. Then, once my eyes open, she starts turning. That sequence makes it feel less like I am discovering her and more like she is reacting to me. I know that is probably just how my hallucination works. Still, in the moment, it feels personal. It feels like she knows when I am awake. Maybe that is why I am so afraid of seeing her face. Some part of me worries that if I look at her fully, the pattern will change. Right now, the experience always ends the same way. I close my eyes. The pressure increases. The voices become deafening. Then everything becomes silent. Eventually, I can move again. As awful as that is, at least I know the sequence. What happens if I do something different? What if I keep looking? Does she finish turning around? Does she speak? Does she move closer? Does the paralysis last longer? Obviously, those fears are not logical. But sleep paralysis is not a logical experience while it is happening. Fear takes over. So I follow the same pattern every time. Close my eyes. Wait. Do not look. Eventually, it ends. I have gotten used to the fact that this may continue happening. I hate it, but there is not much I can do in the moment. When it starts, I try reminding myself that I have survived every previous episode. The girl has never actually hurt me. The pressure eventually stops. The whispers eventually stop. My body always starts moving again. I tell myself those things. Sometimes they help. Usually, they do not. Because while the girl is sitting there, she does not feel like a harmless hallucination. She feels present. She feels heavy. She feels close. And the malicious part is not even something I can clearly explain. She never attacks me. She never screams. She never reaches down and grabs me. She never says anything. All she does is sit there and slowly turn her head. Yet somehow, that is enough. There is something about knowing that her face is getting closer to my line of sight that fills me with panic every single time. Maybe one day these episodes will stop. I hope they do. Maybe as I get older, my sleep will change and the paralysis will become less frequent. Maybe the recurring hallucination will eventually disappear. I would be perfectly happy never seeing that white dress again. Until then, all I can do is deal with it whenever it happens. At least once a month, I may wake up unable to move. First, there will be whispers. Then, the pressure. Then, I will open my eyes. The little girl will be sitting on my chest with her back toward me. Her long black hair will hang behind her. Her old white lace dress will be visible even in the darkness. Then her head will begin turning. The voices will become louder. I will feel the pressure growing heavier. And just before I see her face, I will close my eyes. After that, the whispers will rise until they are almost deafening. Then they will stop. Silence. Eventually, my body will belong to me again. But I will keep my eyes shut. I always do. I will force myself back to sleep without checking the room. Because even though I know what sleep paralysis is, and even though I understand that hallucinations can come with it, there is still one thought I cannot get rid of. What if one night the paralysis ends, I open my eyes, and she is still there? That possibility is enough to keep my eyes closed every single time. When I was around 12 years old, maybe a year younger or older, my parents were having a lot of work done to the outside of our house. They were replacing the windows, putting up new siding, and making a few other upgrades that required workers to spend days around the property. Because of that, there was equipment everywhere. There were ladders leaning against different sides of the house, tools lying around during the day, stacks of materials, pieces of siding, and all the normal things you would expect during a home renovation. Most of it did not bother me. During the day, the workers would come and go. There would be hammering, drilling, talking, footsteps on ladders, and all kinds of other noise. At night, though, everything became quiet. That was when the equipment outside started looking a little more threatening. My bedroom was on the second floor of the house. My bed sat against the wall directly beneath the windows, so the windows ran along the side of the bed. When I was lying down, they were basically right above and beside me. Normally, I did not think much about that. I had slept in that room for years. The second floor also made me feel safe because no one could simply walk up to the window from outside. At least, that was what I always thought. But during the renovations, there were ladders outside. That changed things. One night, I was asleep when I suddenly woke up because I heard a noise outside my bedroom window. At first, I did not immediately panic. I was still half asleep, and my brain was trying to understand what had woken me. The sound was small. It was almost like someone had thrown a pebble against the glass. A light tap. Then silence. I stayed in bed and listened. Nothing happened for a while. I tried to go back to sleep. Then I heard it again. Another small noise against the window. It sounded enough like a rock or some little object hitting the glass that I began wondering what could be causing it. I knew there was construction equipment outside. Maybe the wind was moving something. Maybe a loose strap on a ladder was hitting the house. Maybe there was a piece of plastic or some other material blowing around. That seemed reasonable. There was no reason to think somebody was outside my second-story bedroom window in the middle of the night. So I tried to ignore it. I closed my eyes. A few minutes passed. Then there was another sound. This one seemed slightly different. It was not just a tap. It sounded like movement. Something scraped against the outside of the house. I opened my eyes again. My room was dark. The windows were right beside me. I stared upward, even though I could not really see anything outside. My first thought was still the wind. The workers had left ladders around the property. Maybe one was shifting. Maybe something hanging from it was moving against the siding. I told myself that was all it was. Then, I heard another noise. A small metallic sound. Then, another scrape. At that point, my imagination started working against me. What if someone was climbing one of the ladders? The thought appeared in my mind and immediately refused to leave. I tried arguing with myself. Who would be climbing a ladder outside the house at night? That made no sense. Maybe one of the workers had forgotten something and come back. But why would they come in the middle of the night? And why would they climb toward my bedroom instead of knocking on the front door? The idea was ridiculous. At least, I wanted it to be. I kept listening. There was silence for another few minutes. My heart slowly began calming down. Then I heard another sound. This time, it seemed lower at first. Then, higher. A scrape. A pause. Another scrape. It really did sound like someone putting their weight on a ladder and climbing one step at a time. I became very still. As a kid, I apparently believed in the classic strategy for surviving frightening situations. Do absolutely nothing. Lie perfectly still. Do not move. Do not make a sound. Maybe whatever is frightening you will somehow disappear. So that was what I did. I stayed in bed and pulled the covers around myself. I tried breathing quietly. I stared into the darkness. I did not want to get up. My parents' bedroom was literally the next room over. It was maybe 5 feet away from mine once I stepped into the hallway. I could have been in their room in seconds. But that would have required getting out of bed. And getting out of bed would mean moving directly beneath those windows. For some reason, that seemed impossible. If there really was someone climbing toward me, I did not want them to see me. So, I stayed frozen. A little more time passed. Then the sound came again. This time it was close, very close. There was no longer any way for me to pretend it was coming from the ground below. Whatever was making the noise seemed to be right outside my window. My stomach tightened. I listened. Then came the sound that completely destroyed the wind explanation. Knocking. It was not loud, but it was definite. Something tapped against the window. Then there was scratching. I stopped breathing for a second. My entire body went cold. Someone was outside my second-story bedroom window. That was what my mind immediately decided. Not the wind. Not a loose piece of construction equipment. A person. I could hear something moving against the glass. I did not look. I honestly cannot remember whether the curtains or blinds were completely closed, but I know I did not want to see what was on the other side. The idea of looking toward the window and seeing a face staring back at me was too much, so I remained still. The scratching continued, then stopped. For a moment, there was silence again. I started hoping maybe it was over. Maybe whatever had been outside had gone away. Then I heard a new sound. The window moved. Not much, just enough to sound like someone was trying to open it. That was the moment when fear finally became stronger than my desire to stay hidden. Someone was not just outside, someone was trying to get in. I jumped out of bed. I did not calmly walk toward the door. I ran. I flew out of my bedroom and into the hallway, then straight into my parents' room. My dad was asleep. I woke him up as quickly as I could. I think there's someone outside my window. He was still half asleep. For a few seconds, he clearly had no idea what I was talking about. I was probably speaking too fast. He blinked at me and tried to understand why his terrified child was standing next to the bed in the middle of the night. I repeated myself. There was someone outside my window. They had been making noise. They were trying to get the window open. That woke him up properly. He got out of bed. I stayed close behind him as he went toward my room. At that point, I was expecting something terrible. Maybe he would open my bedroom door and someone would already be climbing inside. Maybe the window would be open. Maybe we would see a stranger standing on the ladder. My imagination had already created the worst possible situation. My dad entered the room and went toward the windows. Then the truth came out. It was my brother. My fucking brother. Apparently, he had decided to sneak out of the house that night. I do not remember where he had gone or what he had been doing, but at some point he tried to come back home. The problem was that he had locked himself out. He obviously did not want to use the front door and wake my parents, because then they would know he had snuck out. So he came up with what he apparently thought was a brilliant plan. He knew there were ladders outside because of the renovation work. He climbed one of them to my second-floor bedroom window. His idea was to quietly wake me up, get me to open the window or go downstairs, and let him back into the house without our parents ever knowing. In his mind, this was probably supposed to be simple. Climb ladder, tap on my window, wake me, get inside. Nobody finds out. Instead, he managed to make me believe a stranger was climbing toward my bedroom in the middle of the night. Every sound suddenly made sense. The little tapping noises had been him trying to get my attention. The scraping had been him climbing the ladder. The knocking and scratching were him at the window. The sound of someone trying to open it was exactly that. My brother trying to get my window open. I had spent all that time lying completely still while he was outside, wondering why I was not responding. He probably thought I was an incredibly heavy sleeper. Meanwhile, I thought I was about to be murdered. And because I panicked and woke my father, his plan to sneak back in without getting caught failed completely. I do not think that was the ending he had hoped for. Looking back now, the whole thing is funny. At the time, it absolutely was not. When you are 12 years old and hear someone outside your second-floor bedroom window, You do not immediately think, oh, my brother must have secretly left the house, accidentally locked himself out, found a construction ladder, climbed it, and is now trying to wake me without our parents knowing. That is not the first explanation your brain creates. My brain created an intruder. Some stranger had discovered the ladders outside. He had climbed up to the second story. He had found my window. Now he was trying to get inside. For several minutes, I had honestly believed that. The fear had been completely real. I remember how impossible it felt to move. My parents were only a few feet away, yet getting out of bed seemed incredibly dangerous. All I could think was that the person outside might see me. The windows that had always made me feel safe because they were on the second floor suddenly felt like the most dangerous part of the room. The construction changed the whole situation. Normally, someone would have needed an incredible amount of effort to reach them. That night, there was basically a staircase waiting outside. My brother took advantage of it. Unfortunately for him, he picked the worst possible method of getting my attention. Maybe a quiet voice would have worked better. Maybe he could have whispered my name. But I suppose he was also trying not to wake anyone else. Instead, he threw or tapped things against the window, climbed closer, scratched on the glass, knocked, and eventually started messing with the window. Every action made the situation more frightening. There is one part I still laugh about. I remember lying there trying to convince myself that the wind was responsible. The wind. Apparently, I thought wind could climb a ladder. I heard noise moving higher up the wall and still tried to find a normal explanation because the alternative was too frightening. That is something I understand much better now. When people experience something scary, they often spend a surprising amount of time trying to explain it away. You hear a footstep and say it is the house settling. You hear another one and decide it is an animal. You hear someone knocking on your second-story window and tell yourself maybe the wind is throwing something around. Your brain wants the harmless explanation to be true. Mine certainly did. But eventually, when it sounded like someone was physically trying to open the window, I could not pretend anymore. That was when I ran. My brother probably heard me leave and immediately realized he had made a mistake. Then, my dad appeared. I can only imagine the conversation that followed. There was no believable way for my brother to explain why he was standing on a ladder outside my bedroom window in the middle of the night without admitting that he had snuck out. His secret mission ended right there. The experience taught me something else, too. Sometimes the scariest moments do not actually involve anything supernatural or even dangerous. Sometimes you can be absolutely terrified while nothing bad is really happening. My brother was not trying to hurt me. There was no home invader. Nobody had targeted our house. It was just a stupid teenager trying not to get caught by his parents. But for those minutes before I knew the truth, none of that mattered. The fear was real. The noises were real. Someone really was climbing toward my window. Someone really was outside. Someone really was trying to open it. The only thing I had gotten wrong was who it was. Even now, I can remember the exact change in my thinking when I heard the window being touched. Before that, there had still been a little room for doubt. Maybe wind, maybe equipment, maybe some animal. Once the window moved, the situation became simple. There was a person out there. My body reacted immediately. It is funny now because I know the ending. I can picture my brother outside, probably getting increasingly annoyed. Tap, nothing, tap again. Still nothing. Climb higher. Scratch the glass. Why is this idiot not waking up? Try the window. Then suddenly, I'd disappear from the room and wake Dad. Mission failed. He probably knew instantly that he was screwed. I, on the other hand, went from thinking I was in a horror movie to discovering I was living in a family comedy. But whenever I remember the story, I still remember the fear before the reveal more strongly than the relief afterward. The dark bedroom. The window directly above my bed. The sound of something hitting the glass. The scraping outside. That slow realization that the noises seemed to be moving upward. Then the knocking. The scratching. The window handle or frame moving. And me lying there completely still because apparently my childhood survival plan was to pretend I did not exist. My parents were only feet away. I could have run to them almost immediately. Instead, I waited until I was convinced someone was about to come through the window. Thankfully, the terrifying intruder turned out to be my brother. He did get back into the house, just not secretly. And I am pretty sure that after waking our father in the middle of the night and exposing the entire plan, I was the last person he wanted to ask for help again. This happened when I was with my boyfriend at the time, Jay. We were in my bedroom one night, lying together on my bed with all the lights turned off. Nothing unusual had happened earlier that evening. We were not watching anything scary, talking about ghosts, or trying to freak each other out. We were just lying there quietly. We were both awake, but neither of us was speaking. It was one of those moments where two people can be lying right next to each other without feeling the need to fill the silence. We were both just thinking about whatever was on our minds. The room was dark and calm. Then, completely out of nowhere, Jay suddenly rolled toward me and wrapped his arms around me. He hugged me tightly. At first, I did not think much of it. I hugged him back. That was normal enough. But only a second or two later, something changed. A feeling hit me so suddenly and so strongly that I still have trouble describing it properly. If I had been standing, I honestly think it would have felt strong enough to knock me over. It was not physical in the normal sense. Nothing touched me. There was no sound. No object moved. But suddenly I was filled with complete dread. Not nervousness. Not ordinary fear. Dread. It felt like my entire body knew something terrible was nearby before my mind understood what was happening. My chest tightened. My stomach dropped. Every instinct I had seemed to start screaming at once. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. I have experienced panic attacks before. That is important because I know what a panic attack feels like for me. I know the racing thoughts. I know the physical symptoms. I know the feeling of being trapped inside your own fear, even when nothing around you is actually dangerous. This was different. I cannot explain exactly why, but I knew it immediately. It did not feel like the fear was starting inside me. It felt external. It felt like something had entered the room and brought that feeling with it. I hugged Jay harder. He was normally one of those people who always felt warm. Some people just naturally run hot, and he was definitely like that. If I was cold, I could usually curl up against him and feel better almost immediately. But that night, even with his arms around me, I felt freezing. Not slightly cold. Ice cold. It felt like the warmth had been sucked out of the room. I held on to him as tightly as I could. At first, I still did not say anything. Part of me was afraid to speak. I think another part of me was trying to decide whether I was imagining the whole thing. Maybe I was having some strange panic attack. Maybe the room had simply gotten cold. Maybe I had suddenly frightened myself for no reason. But then there was the other feeling, the presence. That is probably the best word I can use. I felt something in the room. More specifically, I felt like it was coming from one corner of my bedroom. I could not see anything. There was no figure standing there. No shadow moved. Nothing made a sound. But I knew exactly where I felt it. It was almost like the feeling you get when someone is standing behind you. You do not necessarily see them. They might not speak. But somehow, your body becomes aware that another person is nearby. Maybe you hear tiny movements without realizing it. Maybe you notice a change in the room. Whatever causes it, sometimes you just know someone is there. That was what this felt like, except the presence did not feel human. It felt evil. I know that sounds dramatic. I know there are plenty of possible explanations for intense fear, but in that moment, the word evil was the only thing that fit. The feeling coming from that corner was awful. It seemed hateful, heavy, wrong. I could not see anything, but I wanted absolutely nothing to do with whatever I believed was there. And because the room was dark, that corner seemed even worse. I did not want to look directly at it. I was afraid that if I stared long enough, I might actually see something. Jay was still holding me tightly. That was when I started wondering why he had suddenly hugged me in the first place. He had rolled toward me before I said anything, before I reacted, before I told him I was scared. Why? Had he felt it too? I worked up enough courage to speak. My voice felt small in the darkness. Jay, do you feel that? There was no long pause. He knew exactly what I meant. He said yes. That answer terrified me more than if he had told me I was imagining everything. He felt it too. The cold, the dread, that awful sense that something evil was in the room. Suddenly, I could not blame it entirely on my own anxiety. Two people were lying next to each other in the same room, both experiencing the same strange shift at almost exactly the same time. We had not discussed it beforehand. Neither of us had suggested anything supernatural. Jay had actually reacted first by grabbing me. That detail has always stayed with me. Maybe there is some normal explanation. Maybe one of us moved or breathed differently and the other reacted unconsciously. Maybe a temperature change in the room caused both of us to become uncomfortable. Maybe fear is contagious, and we somehow picked up on each other's body language without realizing it. I understand those possibilities, but in the moment, none of that mattered. We were scared. The whole experience, from the first feeling of dread to the point where we decided to do something, probably lasted only 30 seconds to a minute. It felt much longer. Time stretches when you are afraid. Every second becomes important. Neither of us wanted to remain in the dark. Jay decided to call his friend Matt. Matt was studying to become a youth pastor. Jay trusted him, and because both of us believed there might be something spiritual happening, calling him seemed like the best idea we had at the time. I finally got out of bed. That took more courage than it probably sounds like. The light switch was not far away, but getting out from under the covers and moving through the room meant feeling exposed. I kept thinking about that corner. I still felt like something was there. I turned the lights on. Immediately, the room looked normal. That was almost frustrating. The bed was there. The walls were there. The furniture was where it was supposed to be. The corner I had been so afraid of looked empty. There was nothing visibly wrong, but the feeling had not completely disappeared. The room still felt heavy. Cold, uncomfortable, I returned to the bed. Jay called Matt and put the phone on speaker. I do not remember every word that was said before the prayer. We probably tried to explain what had happened. Maybe we sounded ridiculous. Two frightened people sitting in a bedroom saying there was something evil in the corner. But Matt took us seriously. He began praying for us. Jay and I closed our eyes. We stayed quiet. Neither of us spoke. I remember listening carefully. At the same time, I prayed silently in my own head. I wanted whatever was in that room to leave. I wanted the cold feeling gone. I wanted the sense of dread to disappear. Most of all, I wanted to feel safe in my own bedroom again. As Matt continued praying, something started changing. Slowly, the pressure in the room seemed to lift. The fear became weaker. The cold faded. It was almost like air returning to a room after a storm. By the time he finished, I could feel a clear difference. The bedroom felt lighter. That is the word I always use. Lighter before the prayer. The atmosphere had felt heavy and dark, even with the lights on. Afterward, it felt normal again. The temperature no longer seemed freezing. I was still shaken, obviously, but that overwhelming sense of something evil being nearby was gone. Jay noticed the same change. That alone was enough to make us feel better. We started talking with Matt normally afterward. Just small talk. Probably trying to calm down and move past what had happened. The worst seemed to be over. Then, Matt asked us a question. Were you two talking while I was praying? Jay and I were confused. No, of course not. We had both been completely silent. We were listening to him. Neither of us had said anything out loud. Matt became more serious. He told us why he had asked. While he was praying, he said he had heard another voice through the phone. A deep voice. Gravelly, according to him, the voice was telling him to stop. I felt sick. The fear that had just started fading came rushing back. Neither Jay nor I had spoken. There was no television playing. There was no one else in the room. As far as I knew, there was nothing nearby that could have created a voice like that. Yet Matt said he had heard something clearly enough to ask whether one of us had been talking. Then, he told us something else. While he was praying, he had also felt a terrible feeling come over him. An evil feeling. That was when the whole situation went from frightening to completely disturbing for me. Matt was not in the room. He was somewhere else, talking to us through the phone. We had told him we were frightened, so of course that could have influenced how he felt. I understand that. Maybe knowing that we believed something evil was happening made him nervous. Maybe the strange voice was interference. Maybe the phone picked up some background noise. Maybe something distorted his own voice through the speaker. Technology does weird things. There are explanations. But at the time, hearing him describe almost the same feeling we had experienced made my skin crawl. The cold. The dread. The evil presence. And now, a voice telling him to stop praying. I was completely freaked out. Jay was too. In fact, he was so freaked out that after the call ended, he decided to leave. That part made me angry. I understood why he was scared. I was scared too. That was exactly why I wanted him to stay. From my point of view, we had just experienced something terrifying together in my bedroom. And now he was going to drive home and leave me alone with whatever had apparently been there. Thanks, but he had clearly reached his limit. He wanted out of the house. So he left. I was not happy about it. The room felt normal again after the prayer, but that did not mean I suddenly felt comfortable being alone. I kept thinking about that corner. I kept thinking about Matt hearing the voice. I kept wondering whether the thing had actually gone away or whether it had only become quiet. My dad was in the house, so at least I was not completely alone. I went to his room. He was asleep. I woke him enough to tell him what had happened. I said something along the lines of thinking a demon had come into my room. Now, I should say that waking someone from deep sleep and immediately telling them that a demon may have entered the house is probably not the best way to get a thoughtful response. My dad barely woke up. He muttered something about having a gun and shooting it. That was basically his contribution. Thanks, Dad. In fairness, he was half asleep. Maybe he did not even understand what I was saying. But there was something almost funny about it. I had just experienced what I believed was a supernatural encounter. My boyfriend had fled. A future youth pastor had apparently heard a demonic voice through a phone, and my dad's solution was apparently that if the demon showed itself, he would shoot it. I did not exactly feel spiritually protected, but at least someone else was in the house. Eventually, I had to return to my room. I do not remember sleeping well that night. How could I? Every time I looked toward that corner, I remembered the feeling. The room itself seemed normal. The lights worked. Nothing moved. There were no strange voices. No sudden cold. Nothing happened again. But I could not stop thinking about the fact that only a short time earlier, both Jay and I had felt something there. What bothered me most was how sudden it had been. There was no buildup, no strange sounds earlier in the night, no objects moving, no doors opening, no history of something constantly haunting me in that room. We were simply lying there, quietly. Then, Jay hugged me. Then the dread hit. It was as if someone had flipped a switch. 1 second, everything was normal. The next, the room felt completely wrong. And after the prayer, it stopped almost as quickly. That pattern is one of the main reasons I have always believed something supernatural happened. I am not saying I can prove it. I cannot. There is no recording of the phone call, no photograph, no strange mark left in the room, nothing physical. All I have is the experience. But 3 people were involved in different ways. Jay and I both felt the sudden cold and the overwhelming sense of evil. Matt, who was not physically with us, later said he heard a deep voice telling him to stop and felt an awful presence while praying. That was enough for me. I became convinced that whatever happened was demonic. I know some people will immediately say it was panic. I have thought about that. As I said, I have had panic attacks. This did not feel like one. During a panic attack, even when the fear is intense, it feels connected to my body and my mind. This felt like I had stepped into someone else's fear, like something had entered the room and filled it with dread. The cold made it even stranger. Jay's body was normally so warm, yet I felt frozen even while he was holding me. And he felt it too. That is the part I always return to. If I had experienced everything alone, I probably would have questioned myself much more. Maybe I had fallen half asleep. Maybe I had some unusual panic response. Maybe I imagined the corner felt wrong. But Jay reacted before I told him anything. He suddenly grabbed me. Then, when I asked whether he felt it, he immediately knew what I meant. That does not prove a demon was there, but it made the experience feel much more real. Then, there was Matt. I still wonder about the voice. What did it actually sound like? How clear was it? Did he hear the words stop exactly? Was it one voice? Did it sound close to the phone? Could it have come from somewhere around him? At the time, I was too frightened to analyze every detail. I just heard a deep, gravelly voice telling me to stop and immediately thought demon. Maybe if we had recorded the call, there would have been a simple explanation. Maybe the sound would have turned out to be static or some kind of audio distortion. But we did not record it. So all I have is what Matt told us. The strange thing is that whatever happened never returned. That is what confuses me more than anything else. If my room had been haunted, I would expect more incidents. If there was some demonic presence attached to the house, why did it only happen once? Why that night? Why those 30 seconds? Why when Jay was there? Why disappear after the prayer and never come back? I have thought about those questions many times. I do not have an answer. Maybe it was never attached to the room. Maybe something passed through. Maybe something was drawn there for a reason I will never understand. Maybe it was connected to one of us. Maybe it was testing us. Maybe it wanted to frighten us. Maybe the entire purpose was simply to get our attention. Or maybe all of those ideas are wrong because nothing supernatural happened at all. That possibility still exists. Two people can feed off each other's fear. If Jay suddenly became tense and grabbed me, maybe I noticed the change without consciously realizing it. Then, I felt afraid. He felt me become afraid. That made him more afraid. Within seconds, both of us could have worked ourselves into a shared panic. The room might have felt colder because fear changes how your body feels. When we called Matt and told him something evil was happening, he might have become nervous too. The voice could have been normal phone interference. The prayer calmed us down, which made the room feel normal again. That is a completely reasonable explanation. I have considered it. But emotionally, I still do not believe that is what happened. There was something about the feeling itself. It was too sudden, too strong, too focused. I knew where it was coming from. That corner. I did not choose that location because I saw something. My attention just went there. It felt like standing in a room with another person whose presence you can sense, even when you are not looking directly at them. Except this presence felt hateful. I wanted nothing to do with it. And when Matt began praying, the feeling disappeared. Maybe that was psychological. Maybe not. I will probably never know. The fact that it never happened again should make me feel better. And mostly, it does. I never had another night where that same cold, evil feeling suddenly filled the room. I never heard voices. I never saw anything in the corner. Nothing followed me. Nothing happened to Jay. As far as I know, nothing strange continued happening to Matt either. The experience came once and then disappeared. But that almost makes it more confusing. What was the point? That is the question I still have. What did it want? If it really was a demon or some kind of malicious presence, why come into the room for less than a minute? Why make itself known? Why allow both of us to feel it? Why react to Matt praying? What was it trying to accomplish? Fear? Maybe that was enough. Maybe frightening us was the entire purpose. Or maybe there was something else happening that none of us understood. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we had done nothing. What if Jay had not called Matt? What if I had not turned on the lights? What if we had stayed in bed and simply waited? Would the feeling have faded by itself? Would it have gotten stronger? Would we have heard something, seen something? Would whatever was in that corner have moved closer? I am glad I never found out. At the time, even 30 seconds felt like too long. I remember how tightly I held Jay. I remember how cold I felt despite being pressed against someone who was always warm. I remember that corner feeling occupied even though I could see nothing there. I remember finally asking, Jay, do you feel that? And I remember the fear I felt when he said yes. That was the moment it stopped being only my experience. Then later, after the prayer, Matt asked whether we had been talking. No, neither of us had. He told us about the voice. Deep, gravelly, telling him to stop. Even now I get chills thinking about that. Maybe some strange sound came through the phone. Maybe there is a perfectly ordinary explanation. But when you put everything together, it is hard for me not to see it as something more. The sudden dread, the cold, the shared sense of a presence, the specific corner, the prayer, the voice, then the immediate feeling of relief afterward. I still believe something entered my room that night. I believe it was something evil. I call it a demon because I do not have a better word for what I felt. I cannot prove that. I can only say that I have experienced panic before, fear before, and anxiety before. This was not like any of them. It felt like fear with a source, like the room itself had changed, like something was standing in that corner and letting us know it was there. And then, after we prayed, it left. At least, I hope it left. Sometimes I think back to my dad's sleepy response and laugh. I have a gun. I'll shoot it. Probably not the most effective plan for dealing with a demon. Still, it helped a little knowing I was not completely alone in the house after Jay drove away. I was definitely annoyed with Jay for leaving. He was terrified, but so was I. If anything, I thought that was more reason for him to stay. Instead, he got in his car and went home while I had to sleep in the room where everything had happened. Thankfully, nothing else occurred. That night passed. Then another night. Then another. The presence never returned. Years later, that remains the strangest part. I am convinced something happened, but I do not understand why. Maybe that is why the memory has stayed with me. If the experience had turned into a long haunting, there might have been some pattern to study. If we had discovered some history about the house, maybe there would be an explanation. If strange things had continued, at least I could say that something was attached to that room. Instead, it was one isolated event, one quiet night, one sudden wave of dread, one freezing room, one dark corner that felt occupied, one phone call, one prayer, one voice telling Matt to stop, and then nothing. It never came back. I am grateful for that. I just wish I knew why it came in the first place. What was it doing there? Why us? Why then? What did it want? I do not think I will ever know. And honestly, maybe I am better off not knowing. I was 9 years old when this happened. It was St. Patrick's Day, and I remember that clearly because I was off from school. At that age, a day off usually meant something good. No classes, no homework for most of the day, and the feeling that I had more freedom than usual. I had no idea that I was about to be involved in one of the most frightening situations of my childhood. At the time, my mom had been seeing a man. I do not remember exactly how long they had been together, but I knew enough to understand that things between them were not going well. Even as a kid, you can tell when adults are angry with each other. Maybe you do not understand the reasons. Maybe you do not understand the history. But you notice the tone of voice. You notice the silence. You notice the way people look at each other. You know when something feels uncomfortable. Their relationship was ending around that time. That day, my mom and I went to his apartment. I honestly cannot remember why. Maybe she needed to pick something up. Maybe they had something to talk about. Maybe there were belongings that needed to be returned. It has been so long that those details are gone from my memory. What I remember is being there. He lived in an apartment building, and I think his place was on the 3rd floor. We went inside. At first, I was in the living room. My mom and the man went somewhere else in the apartment. I do not remember whether it was a bedroom, hallway, or another room. I just remember that I was separated from them. Then the argument started. I could hear them yelling. At 9 years old, adults screaming at each other is frightening in a way that is hard to explain. You do not know what you are supposed to do. You do not know if you should stay where you are. You do not know if you should go find them. You do not know whether the argument is dangerous or whether it is just adults being angry. All you know is that something is wrong. Their voices became louder. They were not calmly disagreeing. They were screaming. Even now, I do not remember the exact words. Maybe I blocked them out. Maybe I simply did not understand enough at the time to remember the details. But I remember the feeling. The apartment no longer felt normal. It felt tense, unstable, like something could happen at any moment. I stayed in the living room. There was not much else I could do. I was a child. I was waiting for my mom. At some point, she came toward me or called to me and told me to go outside. She did not explain why. She just told me to leave the apartment. So I did. I was 9. When your mother tells you to go outside in a situation like that, you do not ask many questions. I went out. I remember waiting. That part feels strange to think about now. I was standing outside while my mother was still inside the apartment with a man who was screaming at her. At the time, I did not know how dangerous that actually was. I thought they were just fighting. Maybe I was scared, but I did not understand the full situation. I did not know there was a gun inside. I did not know he was drunk. I did not know that the gun was loaded. I was just waiting. From my perspective, I was probably only wondering when my mom would come out. Maybe I wondered whether they were still yelling. Maybe I could hear parts of it through the door. I do not remember. What I do remember is the moment she finally came out. She did not casually walk toward me. We ran. She came out, and we moved quickly toward her SUV. That is one of the details that stands out most. There was urgency. Whatever had happened inside, my mom wanted us gone. Immediately, we got to the vehicle. We got inside. And we left. As a child, I knew something bad had happened, but I did not know how bad. That knowledge came years later. For a long time, the memory was just an uncomfortable event from childhood. My mom had been dating a guy. Their relationship was ending. They had a terrible argument. She sent me outside. Then she came out, and we ran to the SUV. That alone was disturbing enough. Then, years later, I learned what had actually been happening inside the apartment. The man had been drunk, and he had a gun. It was loaded. When I learned that, the entire memory changed. Suddenly, every part of that day looked different. The shouting was no longer just an ugly breakup argument. My mom had been in a room with an intoxicated, angry man who had access to a loaded firearm. I had been only a few rooms away. Then I had been waiting outside while she was still in there with him. When my mom told me what happened, I learned that she had somehow managed to get the gun away from him. I cannot imagine what was going through her mind. She had to deal with a drunk man during an angry confrontation, while also knowing that her 9-year-old child was nearby. Somehow, she got control of the gun. Then, she threw it far underneath his large bed. The idea was probably simple. Get the weapon away from him, make it difficult for him to grab it again quickly, then get out. She threw the loaded gun far enough under the bed that he could not immediately reach it. Then, she ran. She came outside to me. And we got away. When I first learned this years afterward, I remember being horrified. As a child, I had no idea how close the situation might have been to becoming something much worse. That is what makes the story so frightening to me now. There are moments from childhood that seem completely different once you understand them as an adult. When you are a kid, you only see part of what is happening. Adults hide things from you. Sometimes they do it because they want to protect you. Sometimes they do it because there is no time to explain. You remember the surface details, the yelling, being told to go outside, running to the car. But years later, someone tells you what was actually happening, and suddenly, your memory becomes terrifying. That is what happened here. At 9 years old, I thought I had been near a bad argument. As an adult, I understand that I had been near a loaded gun in the hands of a drunk and angry man. That changes everything. I have thought about what might have happened if my mom had not been able to take the gun from him. That is the part I hate thinking about. If he had decided to use it, there might have been almost no time to react. Arguments can change very quickly when a gun is present. 1 second, people are yelling. The next second, something happens that cannot be undone. Maybe he never intended to fire it. Maybe he was only holding it. Maybe he was trying to intimidate her. Maybe he was threatening himself. Maybe he was threatening my mom. I do not know every detail. And honestly, I do not want to create details that I was never told. What I do know is enough. He was drunk. He had a loaded gun. My mom believed the situation was dangerous enough to take that gun away from him and hide it under the bed. Then she got us out of there. That tells me everything I need to know about how serious it was. I also think about the fact that my mom sent me outside first. At the time, I probably did not understand why. Now I do. She wanted me away from the argument, away from him, away from the gun. If something happened, she did not want me standing in the living room. That decision may have protected me more than I understood, but it also meant she stayed inside. Alone, I cannot imagine how frightening that must have been for her. As a child, you think of your parents as people who always know what to do. They are adults. They are strong. They are supposed to protect you. You do not usually imagine them being afraid. But my mom must have been terrified, even if she did not show it to me. She was in an apartment with someone she had been in a relationship with, someone who was drunk and angry, and there was a loaded gun involved. She had to think about herself and about me. She had to make decisions quickly. Somehow, she managed to disarm him. She threw the weapon under the bed. Then, she ran. I have wondered how she did it. Did she grab it when he put it down? Did she take it directly from his hands? Did he try to stop her? How close was the situation to becoming violent? I do not know. Maybe I will never know every detail. But the image that stays with me is simple. A loaded gun sliding far underneath a large bed. My mom turning and getting out of the apartment. Then, running to me. That moment probably lasted only a few seconds, but it may have changed both of our lives. There is something strange about knowing that your childhood continued because of one person's quick decision. If my mom had hesitated, things might have happened differently. If she had not gotten the gun away from him, things might have happened differently. If he had managed to grab it again before she escaped, things might have happened differently. There are so many possibilities, and almost all of them are worse than what actually happened. We got away. That is what matters. I think that was also the last time my mom ever saw him. I cannot say with absolute certainty because I was a child and did not know every detail of her adult life. But as far as I know, that was the end. And honestly, it should have been. There are situations where walking away is not just about ending a relationship. It is about survival. When someone is intoxicated, angry, and armed, nothing good can come from staying around to see what happens next. My mom got out. She took me with her. That man disappeared from our lives. For years, I did not understand exactly why. Then, I learned the truth. Now, when I think back to that St. Patrick's Day, the memory feels completely different from how it did when I was 9. I remember being in the living room. I remember hearing them screaming. I remember not knowing what was happening. I remember my mom telling me to go outside. I remember obeying. I remember waiting. Then I remember her coming out and us running to the SUV. At the time, I probably thought the argument had simply gotten too bad. I did not know that there was a loaded weapon under a bed behind us. I did not know that my mom had just taken it away from a drunk man. I did not know how close we might have been to a tragedy. That realization came later. And in some ways, learning the truth years afterward was scarier than the event itself. During the actual event, I was protected by ignorance. I did not understand the danger. I was afraid because adults were yelling. That was all. Years later, I had enough life experience to understand what a loaded gun means. I understood what alcohol can do in an already violent argument. I understood how quickly a situation like that can turn deadly. Then I looked back at the memory with adult eyes. That was when it became terrifying. I sometimes think about the apartment itself. I can barely remember what it looked like now. I remember enough to picture the living room. I remember that he lived several floors up, probably the third floor. I remember leaving the apartment and waiting outside. But the details are faded. Childhood memories are strange like that. Certain things disappear. Others remain sharp. I cannot remember why we went there. I cannot remember the exact words they were screaming. I cannot remember how long I waited outside. But I remember running to the SUV. That urgency stayed. Maybe my brain understood more than I consciously did. Maybe I could tell from my mom's face that something serious had happened. Maybe the way she moved told me not to ask questions. There was no slow walk, no standing around, no goodbye. We ran, and when I later learned about the gun, that part suddenly made sense. Of course we ran. She had just taken a loaded firearm away from him and hidden it. She knew he could eventually retrieve it. The bed was not a safe. Throwing the gun underneath it did not remove the danger permanently. It only bought time. That is another part that scares me. She did not take the gun with her. She could not simply stand around waiting for police or trying to reason with him. The goal was not to solve the situation. It was to create enough distance between him and the weapon for us to escape. She got the gun out of his immediate reach. Then she left. That was the safest thing she could do in those seconds. We reached the SUV. The doors closed. We drove away. And he did not follow us. At least, not that I remember. What happened inside the apartment after we left, I do not know. Maybe he crawled under the bed and got the gun. Maybe he passed out. Maybe he calmed down. Maybe someone else became involved. I have no idea. By that point, we were gone. That is enough for me. I have heard people talk about how children often do not realize when they have survived something dangerous. I understand that now. Sometimes the danger is obvious. A car accident, a fire, an injury. You know immediately that something bad almost happened. Other times, you only find out years later. Someone tells you a detail your parents kept from you. Suddenly a memory you had always considered strange becomes horrifying. That is exactly what this is for me. I had carried the memory for years without knowing what was hidden underneath it. Then my mom told me. Loaded gun. Drunk man. She took it from him. Threw it under the bed. Ran. Those few details changed everything. I also think about how young I was. 9 years old. At that age, I still trusted adults in a way children naturally do. Adults had rules. Adults controlled situations. Adults were supposed to know what they were doing. I had no reason to imagine that a grown man my mom knew could suddenly become dangerous. Even if I heard them screaming, some part of me probably assumed things would eventually calm down. That is what usually happens in a child's mind. Adults fight. Then the fight ends, life continues. But sometimes adults do things children cannot understand. Sometimes they are drunk. Sometimes they lose control. Sometimes weapons are involved. Sometimes one bad decision can destroy a family. I was lucky not to understand any of that in the moment. My mom protected me from the worst part of it. She sent me outside. I did what she said. She dealt with the danger. Then she came for me. I have a lot of respect for what she did now. I do not know whether I would have had the same courage. People can say what they would do in a dangerous situation, but nobody really knows until they are there. Would you freeze? Would you run? Would you fight? Would you be able to grab a weapon from someone who is drunk and angry? I do not know. My mom did what she needed to do. She got the gun away. She got me out. We survived the day. That is the important part. Still, I sometimes think about how close the loaded gun was to me physically. I was in the same apartment, maybe only a room or two away. While I was sitting there, probably confused and uncomfortable, there was a weapon somewhere nearby. I did not know. That ignorance is disturbing in hindsight. Children depend completely on the adults around them. They can be standing next to danger and never understand it. I was waiting for my mom to finish an argument. Meanwhile, she may have been trying to keep both of us alive. That is a hard thing to process years later. I also think about him. Not because I miss him. I barely knew him in the way an adult would. But I wonder what was happening in his mind. How does someone reach a point where a loaded gun becomes part of an argument with someone they supposedly cared about? Was he threatening her? Was he trying to scare her? Was he so drunk that he did not understand what he was doing? Again, I do not know, and I am not sure I need to know. There are some details that would only make the memory worse. What matters is that the danger was real enough for my mother to act. A loaded gun does not need to be fired to change a situation. Its presence alone changes everything. Once a weapon enters an argument, every movement matters. Every word matters. Every second matters. One mistake can become permanent. My mom understood that. She got it away from him. Then she left. Looking back, I am grateful she did not stay to argue more. There is always a temptation to get the last word, to finish the conversation, to demand an explanation, to make the other person understand. But sometimes the smartest thing is to leave. She had already done the dangerous part. She had taken the gun. There was nothing left to discuss. She came out to me, and we ran. I imagine her heart must have been pounding. Maybe her hands were shaking. Maybe she was trying not to scare me. I do not remember whether she said anything in the car. Maybe she told me everything was fine. Parents do that. They say everything is okay while they are still trying to process what just happened. Maybe she stayed quiet. Maybe she drove faster than usual. Those details are gone. What remained was the image of us getting away. Then, years later, the truth attached itself to that memory. There is one thought that still gets to me more than anything else. If things had gone differently, I might not have learned the truth years later. There might not have been a later. That is the terrifying part. It is easy to look back on dangerous situations once you know everyone survived. They become stories. You tell them at family gatherings. You explain what happened. You say it was crazy. But during the event, the ending is not guaranteed. There was a moment in that apartment when nobody knew what would happen next. My mom did not know. I definitely did not know. The man with the gun probably did not know. There was no narrator saying, "Do not worry, they are going to escape." It could have ended in many different ways. We just happened to get the good ending. And even calling it good feels strange. A relationship ended. My mom had to disarm someone. A 9-year-old child had to wait outside while adults screamed. None of that is good. But we walked away. So compared with what could have happened, it was the best possible outcome. I think that was the last time she ever saw him. I hope it was. Some relationships should end permanently. There is no fixing a moment like that with an apology. You cannot casually move on from someone being drunk with a loaded gun during an argument. At least, I could not. Maybe my mom felt the same. Whatever connection they had before that day, it was over. Years later, I understood why. Even now, the story does not scare me in the same way as a ghost story or something supernatural. There was no shadow figure, no strange voice, no unexplained sound. Nothing impossible happened. That is what makes it worse. This was real. A real apartment, a real argument, a real drunk man, a real loaded gun, a real child sitting only a few rooms away. Sometimes the most frightening stories are the ones where nothing supernatural needs to happen. People are enough. Anger is enough. Alcohol is enough. A weapon is enough. I was 9 years old and thought I was just listening to my mom have an ugly argument with her boyfriend. Years later, I found out that my mother had taken a loaded gun away from him, thrown it as far as she could under his bed, and gotten us out before he could reach it again. When I think about that now, the memory feels completely different. I can still picture myself going outside because my mom told me to. A child waiting without understanding. Then the door opening, my mom appearing, the sudden rush toward the SUV, the feeling that we needed to leave right now. At the time, I did not know what we were running from. Now I do. And knowing what was happening only a few feet away from me while I sat there as a 9-year-old still terrifies me. I am just thankful my mom got the gun away from him. I am thankful she told me to go outside. I am thankful she ran. And more than anything, I am thankful that St. Patrick's Day became a frightening childhood memory instead of the day something happened that none of us could ever take back. A friend and I used to go running after school. We both liked being outside, and whenever we could, we tried to avoid normal sidewalks and roads. Running on pavement was fine, but trails were always better. There was something about being away from traffic and buildings that made the whole thing more enjoyable. We liked dirt paths, hills, wooded areas, and places where you could get a little distance from everything. There was one trail in particular that we used fairly often. It started above a park and climbed up a steep dirt hill. Once you made it to the top, the trail continued along a ridge that overlooked a nearby valley. It was a beautiful place. From the ridge, you could see a long way out. The land dropped away below, and the whole area felt open and quiet. There were not many people around most of the time. That was one of the things we liked about it. At the same time, it also made the trail feel a little isolated. There were some cows in the area, and every once in a while you might see signs that people had passed through, but for the most part it felt empty. Just open land, dirt, grass, and the trail. We never thought of it as a dangerous place. It was simply a good running route. We were used to being there. We knew the steep part of the hill. We knew where the trail leveled out. We knew the areas where the view opened up. It was familiar. That probably matters because when something strange happens in a place you know, it hits differently. If you are in a new place and hear a weird noise, you can tell yourself that maybe the area just sounds like that. Maybe there are animals you do not recognize. Maybe there are machines or roads nearby that you cannot see. But when you know the area and know what normal sounds like, something unfamiliar stands out immediately. One afternoon after school, my friend and I went out there like we had before. Nothing felt unusual. The weather was normal. The trail looked the same. We started running. The first part was tiring because of the hill, but once we reached the ridge, things got easier. We continued for a while. Eventually, we slowed down. I do not remember whether we were tired or just taking a short break, but instead of running, we started walking. We were talking normally. There was no fear, no strange feeling. Nothing had happened yet. Then we heard something. That is the part I still have trouble describing. It was a sound, obviously, but saying that does not explain it. The sound was wrong. That is the only word that really fits. Wrong. The moment we heard it, both of us stopped. We did not have to discuss it. We did not look at each other and say, "Was that strange?" We froze. Immediately, My body reacted before my mind had time to understand what I was hearing. There was something about that noise that made every part of me say the same thing. No, absolutely not. Get away from that. It was not like hearing a normal animal growl and thinking, that sounds dangerous. It was not like hearing a dog bark behind you. It was not even like hearing a mountain lion scream, which can sound terrifying if you have never heard one before. This felt different. The sound itself seemed unnatural, not mechanical, not electronic, not like a car, not like metal scraping. It was clearly coming from something alive. That is one detail I want to make very clear. Whatever made that noise was alive. We both knew that. It had the quality of a living creature making a sound. Breath, throat, voice, something biological. But whatever animal it came from, it sounded deeply wrong. I wish I could imitate it. I cannot. Even now, I do not know how to describe the exact pitch or shape of the sound. I only remember the reaction it caused. My body went cold. My muscles tightened. Every instinct I had suddenly became alert. It felt like some old part of my brain, something beneath conscious thought, had heard that sound and recognized danger. Not a specific danger. I did not think that is a bear. I did not think that is a mountain lion. I did not think that animal is about to attack us. It was more basic than that. Whatever that is, do not go toward it. Do not investigate it. Do not stay here. That was the feeling. The worst part was how close it sounded. Maybe 20 feet away. Maybe 30. Not far. Close enough that whatever made the sound could have been just behind a rise, a bush, or some part of the trail we could not see clearly. That made it much worse. If we had heard the same sound far down in the valley, maybe we would have been curious. We might have stopped and tried to figure out where it came from. But this was right there, somewhere close, and we could not see what made it. My friend heard it too. That was important. If I had been alone, I might have spent years wondering whether I imagined it. Maybe I was tired from running. Maybe a normal noise sounded strange because I was out of breath. Maybe my mind turned it into something worse afterward. But my friend reacted the same way. We both stopped. We both knew something was wrong. There was no disagreement. Neither of us laughed. Neither of us said it was probably nothing. The sound had crossed some invisible line. It had taken a normal afternoon run and changed it instantly. I remember the silence afterward. That may have been almost as bad as the sound itself. We stood there, waiting, listening. When you hear something strange once, your brain immediately wants more information. Will it happen again? Will it move? Will you hear footsteps? Branches breaking? Breathing? Another call? But at the same time, I did not actually want to hear it again. I wanted the whole thing to stop. I wanted to keep walking and pretend it had not happened. But my body was still on alert. Every small sound around us suddenly mattered. Wind in the grass, movement in bushes, birds, anything the ridge no longer felt beautiful. It felt exposed. A few seconds earlier, being isolated had been peaceful. Now it meant there was nobody else around if something happened. No houses close by. No group of hikers. No people to call out to. Just us. And whatever had made that noise. I do not remember exactly what we said to each other afterward. Probably something simple. Did you hear that? What the hell was that? But words were almost unnecessary. We both knew. Something was nearby. Something alive. And neither of us wanted anything to do with it. That instinctive reaction is the part that still bothers me most. Years later, I had another experience that brought that feeling back. It happened during a field trip to an anatomy lab. The situations were completely different. No trail, no dark woods, no unknown animal. We were in a controlled environment. There was nothing mysterious about what we were seeing. The bodies in the lab were preserved for education. We knew exactly why they were there. But when I first smelled the preserved corpse, my body reacted. There was something about that smell. It was not just unpleasant. It produced a deeper reaction. Before I could think, my whole body seemed to say the same thing it had said on that ridge. No, wrong, stay away. It was a physical response, almost disgust mixed with fear. Like my body recognized death before my mind needed to explain it. That was when I thought back to the trail. Because the feeling was almost identical. That disturbed me. The smell of a dead body had caused the same instinctive reaction as that sound. Think about that. Years earlier, I had heard an animal noise in the distance, and my body responded to it the same way it later responded to being close to a preserved human corpse. That comparison is what makes the memory so difficult to forget. It was not simply, I heard a creepy animal. I have heard plenty of creepy animal noises. Owls can make strange sounds. Foxes can sound awful. Cats can scream. Coyotes can sound disturbing when a group starts calling. Even cows can make noises that sound bizarre if you hear them from the wrong distance. Animals are capable of producing all kinds of sounds that people do not expect. I know that. But this sound did something different. It made my body react as if I had encountered something physically wrong. Something I was not supposed to be near. That does not mean it was supernatural. I am not claiming that. I actually think it probably was an animal. In fact, I am certain it was an animal noise. That is another thing I want to be clear about. It did not sound like a machine. It did not sound like some random mechanical problem. It was not a vehicle. It was not a piece of farm equipment. It was not metal rubbing together. Whatever produced that sound was a living thing. I am sure of that. The question is, what kind of living thing? I have gone through possibilities in my head. Maybe it was an injured animal. That could explain why the sound seemed wrong. Animals in pain can make noises that are very different from their normal calls. A wounded deer can sound strange. A sick cow can make sounds you would never expect. An animal caught in something might produce a noise that is hard to identify. That is possible. Maybe we heard some local animal making a warning call we had never heard before. Animals have different sounds for fear, aggression, mating, injury, and communication. Sometimes one species can sound completely different depending on the situation. Maybe that was all it was. But the memory does not feel harmless. Even if there is an ordinary explanation, the experience itself was not ordinary. There are some moments where your conscious mind is behind your body. Your instincts react first. You touch something hot and pull your hand away before you fully understand the pain. You step near the edge of a cliff and your stomach drops, even though you know you are safe. You smell spoiled food and immediately feel disgust. The body makes decisions quickly because, for most of human history, quick reactions kept people alive. That is what this felt like. My body had already made the decision. Whatever made that sound was bad. It did not matter that I could not identify it. Maybe that was exactly why the reaction was so strong. Humans like recognizable threats. If I see a large dog growling at me, I know what I am dealing with. If I see a snake on the trail, I know to step back. If I hear a cow nearby, I understand the sound. The unknown is worse, especially when the unknown is close. 20 or 30 feet is nothing. If there was an animal hidden in the grass or bushes, it could have reached us quickly. We had no idea how large it was. We had no idea whether it was aggressive. We had no idea whether it had seen us. Maybe the sound was directed at us. That thought still bothers me. What if it knew we were there? Maybe the sound was a warning. Maybe whatever was hidden nearby had watched us running along the ridge. Then, when we slowed down, it made that noise. If it was territorial, maybe it wanted us to leave. If it was injured, maybe it was afraid of us. If it was hunting, maybe it was doing something else entirely. We did not know, and we did not stay around to learn. I am glad we did not investigate. People in scary stories always seem to do that. They hear something strange and decide to walk toward it. I have never understood that. When your entire body is telling you to go in the opposite direction, listen. We listened. We did not go searching through the grass. We did not climb down the ridge to see what was there. We did not try to get closer. There was no reason to. Curiosity is not worth getting hurt, especially when you are two kids or teenagers out running with no real protection. I do not remember exactly how quickly we left. I think we kept moving and put distance between ourselves and the area. I doubt we ran at full speed immediately because we were still trying to listen, but there was no chance we were staying there. The trail felt completely different on the way out. I kept looking around. Every bush seemed suspicious. Every movement in the grass made me tense. The cows in the distance no longer felt like part of a peaceful rural scene. Everything felt wild. It reminded me that even places people use for exercise are still part of nature. Animals live there. Things move around when humans are not present. You can spend years walking the same trail and never know everything that lives nearby. That thought stayed with me. The park below was normal. The trail was normal. The ridge was normal. But somewhere just off that path, something made a sound that neither of us recognized. And for a few seconds, that whole place became frightening. I have tried to remember whether we ever heard the sound again. I do not think we did. Maybe it only happened once. That almost makes it harder to identify. If we had heard it repeatedly, maybe we could have compared it later to recordings of local wildlife. A single strange noise is much harder. Memory also changes over time. I know that. The exact sound in my head may not be perfectly accurate anymore. Years have passed, but the reaction is clear. I remember the freeze. I remember looking at my friend. I remember knowing we had both heard the same thing. And I remember that deep feeling of refusal. No, that is what my body said. Not curiosity. Not confusion. No, the comparison to the anatomy lab made me trust that memory even more. The smell of preserved human remains was obviously different from an animal sound, but the reaction happened in the same place inside me. It bypassed thought. The smell reached me, and my body immediately rejected it. That makes sense from an evolutionary point of view. The smell of death can mean disease, danger, or something you should avoid. Maybe the sound on the ridge carried some similar signal. Maybe the animal making it was badly injured or dying. Maybe there was something in the tone that humans are naturally sensitive to. Pain, sickness, predation, I do not know. But something in it reached me before I had words for it. That is why I still shudder when I remember. It was not only that the sound was creepy, it felt biologically wrong. Like hearing something that your body knew before your brain did. I have listened to recordings of different animals over the years. I have heard mountain lions, foxes, coyotes, owls, rabbits screaming, deer making strange noises. Some of them are horrible. If you hear them at night without knowing what they are, they can sound supernatural. But none of them have given me that same feeling while listening through speakers. Maybe context matters. Hearing a recording while sitting safely indoors is not the same as hearing something unknown 20 feet away on an isolated ridge. That could be part of it. Maybe if I heard the exact same animal sound now on my phone, I would laugh and immediately know what it was. But that day, standing there in the open with no idea what was hidden nearby, it felt completely different. There is also something about not seeing the source. A sound without a visible cause gives your imagination too much freedom. If a strange animal had stepped out onto the trail, maybe the fear would have decreased. Oh, that is what it is. Even if it were dangerous, at least we would understand. Instead, we had only the sound. The landscape around us stayed empty. Nothing appeared. That meant whatever made it could have been anywhere close by. Hidden below the ridge, behind brush, in tall grass, just beyond our view. I sometimes wonder whether it was watching us the whole time. Maybe we passed very close to it without realizing. Maybe it had been there before we stopped walking. Maybe the sound was the first and only warning we got. That thought gives me chills. I also wonder what would have happened if we had continued toward it. Maybe nothing. Maybe we would have found a sick cow. Maybe an injured deer. Maybe some animal trapped in a fence. There could have been a completely ordinary explanation waiting 20 feet away. But I am still glad we did not check. There are moments when instinct should win over curiosity. That was one of them. Even now, when I think about the experience, I do not picture some monster. I do not imagine a demon hiding in the grass. I do not need to. The real memory is disturbing enough. A quiet trail, a beautiful ridge, two friends slowing down after a run, then a sound from very close by. A living thing making a noise that neither of us could identify, and both of us freezing at the exact same moment. That is what stayed with me. Not because I can prove something impossible was there, because I cannot explain why the sound felt so deeply wrong. Maybe one day someone will hear my description and know exactly what animal it was. I would actually like that. A normal explanation would make the memory easier. But even if someone identified the animal, I do not think I would forget the reaction. That feeling was real. Years later, I smelled a preserved corpse in an anatomy lab and felt my body make the same decision. Get away. Do not stay near this. Something is wrong. The fact that those two completely different experiences produced the same reaction is what still creeps me out. Whatever made that noise on the ridge was alive. I am certain of that. It was not a car. It was not machinery. It was not something blowing in the wind. It was an animal. I just do not know what kind. And maybe the most unsettling part is that sometimes the body recognizes danger without explaining it to you. We spend a lot of time believing our conscious thoughts are in control. But there are older systems underneath that. Instinct, fear, disgust, the automatic reactions that kept our ancestors alive long before anyone could stop and analyze what they were hearing. That day, something made a sound 20 or 30 feet away. My mind did not know what it was. My body apparently had an opinion. It told me to leave, so we did. I have never forgotten that sound. More accurately, I have never forgotten what it did to me. Even now, thinking about standing on that ridge and hearing it from somewhere close by makes me shudder. Maybe it was just an animal. I actually believe it was. But whatever animal it was, I hope I never hear that sound again. About 15 years ago, I worked for a fairly small company with around 75 employees. It was not a huge place, so most people knew each other, at least by name. You saw the same faces every day, ate lunch with the same people, and usually knew who got along with whom. For a while, things were normal. Then the owner decided to sell the company. Whenever ownership changes, people start getting nervous. Nobody knows what the new owners are going to do. Some people hope things will improve. Others worry about losing their jobs. In our case, the new owners came in and immediately started making big changes. One of the first things they did was fire a lot of people. Around 15 employees were let go. For a company of our size, that was a lot. One of the people who lost his job was a guy I worked with. I will call him Dave. Dave had been with the company for several years, and from what I remember, he was completely shocked when they fired him. A lot of the rest of us were not as surprised. Dave was a strange guy. I do not mean that in a cruel way. He was just difficult to be around sometimes. He had a short temper and could suddenly get angry over small things. He sometimes yelled at coworkers. There were also some personal hygiene issues. He had really bad dandruff and noticeable body odor, which made some people avoid being near him for long. Because of all that, Dave was not especially popular. A lot of people did not get along with him. Some were actually happy when they found out he had been fired. I was not celebrating it, but I could understand why the new owners had decided to let him go. Dave had a reputation. Still, I never considered him dangerous. Odd? Yes, difficult, definitely. But dangerous? No, at least not until about a week after he was fired. I was at work when I got a phone call. It was Dave. That surprised me a little, because I had not expected to hear from him after he left. He told me that he wanted to take me out to lunch. He said he wanted to thank me, because before he had been fired, I had taught him how to operate a few different machines at the company. According to him, knowing how to use those machines would make it easier for him to find another job. That sounded reasonable. I had helped train him on some equipment, and if that knowledge really helped him get hired somewhere else, I was glad. So when he offered to buy me lunch as a way of saying thanks, I agreed. I did not think much of it. I actually assumed he was probably going to take several former coworkers out. Maybe he wanted to say goodbye properly. Maybe he wanted to thank a few people who had helped him. A few days later, Dave arrived at the company around lunchtime. That was when I realized I had misunderstood the situation. He was not taking a group of us out. It was just me. That felt a little strange, but not enough to make me refuse. Dave and I had never been especially close, but we had gotten along better than he did with some other people. Maybe that was why he had invited me. We got into his car and left for lunch. At first, everything seemed fine. We talked normally. He thanked me again for teaching him the machines. I told him I hoped it helped him find another job. For the first part of lunch, nothing happened that made me think I was in danger. Then the conversation slowly started changing. Dave began talking about being fired. He was angry, really angry. At first, I understood why. Losing a job is upsetting, especially when you have worked somewhere for years. Dave felt like the company had betrayed him. He had spent a long time there. Then new owners showed up, and suddenly, he was gone. From his point of view, it probably felt unfair, so I let him vent. I listened. I sympathized with him. I told him I understood why he was upset. Honestly, at that stage, I thought that was all he needed. Someone to listen. People say things when they are angry. They complain about bosses. They complain about coworkers. They say the company is terrible. They say they hope the place fails. That kind of thing happens all the time. So I did not immediately become alarmed. But as lunch continued, Dave's anger became more personal. He started talking about specific people at the company. He said I was one of the few people there he actually liked. That statement by itself was uncomfortable. Then, he said there were people at the company he would love to hurt. That was the first moment where I really started paying attention. I remember thinking that the conversation had crossed the line. Before that, he had been complaining about losing his job. Now he was talking about hurting people. Still, I tried to tell myself he was just venting. Maybe he did not mean it literally. People say, I could kill that guy without actually wanting to murder someone. People get angry and use extreme language. I thought maybe this was one of those situations. So I did not confront him. I did not accuse him of planning anything. I simply let the conversation continue. Lunch was almost over anyway. I was ready to get back to work. We paid and walked back to his car. That was when things became much worse. Once we were inside the car, Dave started talking about the company building itself. He said it would be easy to lock the doors from the outside using boards. Then he talked about burning the place down. I remember listening to him and feeling my stomach tighten. This was no longer a general statement about being angry. He was talking about a method. Boards, doors, fire. He seemed to have actually thought about how someone could trap people inside the building. Then he started talking about doing damage to the company. I cannot remember every exact word he used, but the meaning was clear enough. He was thinking about ways the place could be attacked. At that point, I was getting seriously uncomfortable. We were alone in his car. I suddenly became very aware of that fact. I had gone to lunch thinking I was helping a former coworker feel better. Now I was sitting next to a guy who was talking about trapping people inside a building and setting it on fire. I did not know what he had in the car. I did not know what he planned to do. I did not know whether he was just talking. And because I was sitting beside him, I did not want to say anything that might make him angry. Dave already had a short temper. I had seen him yell at people before. Now he had just lost his job and seemed angrier than I had ever seen him. So I stayed calm. I did not argue. I did not tell him he was crazy. I did not challenge him. I just waited for us to get back to the company. The drive back felt longer than it probably was. I kept listening while trying to decide how seriously I should take what he was saying. Part of me was still trying to rationalize it. Maybe this was just anger. Maybe he had no intention of doing anything. Maybe he was trying to sound tough. But another part of me was becoming more and more alarmed. Then we pulled into the company parking lot. As we were arriving, Dave said something I will never forget. He told me not to worry. He said that even if he could hurt some of those people, I was his friend. The way he said it sent chills through me. It did not sound like a joke. It did not sound like normal venting anymore. It sounded like he had mentally separated people into categories. People he was angry with. And me, the friend, the person he would spare. That was what made the situation suddenly feel real. I remember thinking that I needed to get out of the car. I said goodbye. I tried to act normal. Then I got out and went back inside the building. The moment I was away from him, my mind started racing. I kept replaying the things he had said. Lock the doors, boards, burn the place down, do damage, people he wanted to hurt. I was his friend. Every sentence sounded worse once I was no longer sitting next to him. I walked inside and tried to decide what to do. Near my boss's desk, there was a window that looked out into the parking lot. From there, I could see Dave's car. I expected him to leave. He did not. He was still sitting there. At first, I thought maybe he was checking his phone. Maybe he was making a call. Maybe he was getting ready to drive away. A few minutes passed. He stayed. Lunch break started ending. Employees returned to work. People went back inside. Machines started running again. Everyone returned to their normal positions, and Dave was still sitting in his car, watching the building. That was when my fear became much stronger. If he had simply dropped me off and driven away, maybe I would have convinced myself that he had only been venting. But he was not leaving. He had just spent lunch talking about hurting people at the company. Now he was sitting in the parking lot after everyone had gone back inside. I remember looking at the car and thinking that something was wrong, very wrong. I went to my boss. I told him what had happened. I explained that Dave had said some strange and threatening things during lunch. I told him about the comments involving burning the building and hurting people. I also told him Dave was still outside in the parking lot. I said we needed to call 911. Thankfully, my boss took me seriously. He did not laugh it off. He did not tell me I was overreacting. He made the call. The police arrived within minutes. Those few minutes felt very long. I kept watching Dave's car through the window. I remember wondering what he was doing. Was he waiting for someone? Was he building up the courage to come inside? Was he changing his mind? Was he watching the doors? I had no idea. Every second he remained there made the situation feel more dangerous. I also started thinking about the layout of the building. There were a lot of employees inside. The way the workplace was designed, someone entering with a weapon could reach a lot of people very quickly. There were work areas where employees were grouped together. There were not many places to hide. I suddenly became aware of how vulnerable everyone was. The police cars pulled into the parking lot. Officers approached Dave's vehicle. From inside, we watched. They spoke with him. At first, things looked calm. He did not try to drive away. He did not fight them. Eventually, they got him out of his car. Then, they put him in the back seat of a police vehicle. That was already a relief. At least he was no longer sitting alone in his car outside the building. But then, the officers started searching. They used Dave's keys to open the trunk. That was when everything changed. Inside the trunk, they found boards, rope, and several guns. I remember hearing that and feeling sick. Boards, the same kind of thing he had just talked about using to lock the doors from the outside. He had mentioned boards during lunch. Now there were boards in his trunk. There was rope. There were guns. Suddenly, the possibility that he had only been venting became much harder to believe. I do not know exactly what he intended to do. Maybe he never would have done anything. Maybe the boards had some innocent purpose. Maybe the rope did too. People keep things in their trunks. There can be normal explanations. Even guns can be legally owned. But when someone talks about trapping people inside a building, hurting coworkers, and doing damage, then sits outside that building with boards, rope, and guns in his car, it is difficult to ignore the connection. The police continued talking to Dave. From what I was told, he eventually agreed to go with them. He agreed to be taken into custody and get help. There was no shootout, no one was hurt, nothing happened inside the company. And I am incredibly grateful for that. But after the police left with him, I could not work. I tried. I really did. But my hands were shaking. My mind was somewhere else. I kept thinking about lunch. I kept thinking about sitting next to him in the car. I kept thinking about him telling me I was his friend. I kept thinking about the guns in his trunk. What frightened me most was how close I had been to the situation without realizing it. When Dave first called me, I thought he wanted to thank me. That was all. I agreed to lunch because it seemed harmless. If I had known what was in his trunk, I never would have gotten into his car. If I had known what he was going to talk about, I never would have gone. But I did. I sat beside him. I listened while he described ways the company could be attacked. Then he told me I would be safe because he liked me. That thought still gives me chills. Sometimes I wonder why he invited me. Was it really because he wanted to thank me? Maybe. Maybe he genuinely appreciated the training I'd given him. Maybe he saw me as one of the few people who treated him well. But I also wonder whether he wanted someone to hear his thoughts. Maybe he was warning me. Maybe he wanted me out of the building. Maybe he wanted me to understand that I was not one of his targets. I do not know. That uncertainty still bothers me. If he was planning something, why tell me anything? Maybe part of him wanted to be stopped. Maybe he was not thinking clearly. Maybe he was trying to scare me. There are a lot of possibilities. I will never know which one is true. What I do know is that his behavior matched his words enough for the police to take the situation seriously. He talked about locking doors with boards. Boards were in the trunk. He talked about hurting people. Guns were in the trunk. He sat in the parking lot after everyone returned from lunch. Those facts are difficult to forget. Afterward, people at work learned what had happened. The mood changed immediately. A lot of coworkers who had been glad to see Dave fired suddenly realized how serious the situation might have become. Before that day, most people simply thought of him as difficult. He smelled bad. He had dandruff. He yelled sometimes. He was awkward. He had a temper. Those things were annoying, but they did not make us think he might hurt anyone. Then suddenly we were thinking about what could have happened if the police had not arrived. I thought about where different employees stood during the day. I thought about the entrances. I thought about how quickly someone could move through the building. If Dave had decided to come inside with the guns, there might have been almost no warning. People would have been working. Machines would have been running. The environment was noisy enough that some employees might not immediately understand what was happening. That possibility terrified me. I also thought about the fact that I might have been the last person to sit with him before it happened. Imagine carrying that memory afterward. Imagine surviving because he considered you a friend while watching coworkers get hurt. That thought made me feel physically ill. Thankfully, none of it happened. The police arrived. They intervened. Dave went with them. Everyone went home alive. That is the ending that matters. Still, it took me a long time to calm down. For the rest of that day, every time I looked toward the parking lot, I remembered his car sitting there. I could picture him behind the wheel, not leaving, just waiting. I kept thinking about how close we might have been to something terrible. Maybe there was never a real plan. That is possible. I want to be fair about that. I cannot say with certainty that Dave intended to attack the company. I am not inside his mind. Nobody can know exactly what he would have done if the police had not come. Maybe he would have sat there for another 10 minutes and then driven home. Maybe he would have decided that his thoughts were stupid. Maybe he would have gotten help on his own. But I also cannot pretend the situation was harmless. Someone who is angry after being fired, talks about killing or hurting coworkers, describes ways to trap people inside a building, and then remains outside that building with firearms and other materials in his car, is not something you ignore. Calling the police was the right decision. I have never regretted it. Even if Dave never intended to do anything, I would rather have overreacted and kept everyone safe than ignored the warning signs and spent the rest of my life wishing I had spoken up. That is one of the biggest things I took from the experience. People often worry about looking foolish. You hear someone say something disturbing and think maybe they are joking. You notice strange behavior and wonder whether you are overthinking it. You do not want to create drama. You do not want to get someone in trouble. But there are times when it is better to say something. That day was one of those times. My instincts were telling me that Dave was not okay. The conversation felt wrong. The way he said I was his friend felt wrong. The fact that he stayed in the parking lot felt wrong. I listened to that feeling. I told my boss. He called the police. I am very glad he did. Years later, I still remember the moment in the car when Dave said I did not need to worry. I can still hear the meaning behind it. You are different. You are safe. The others are not. Maybe that was not what he meant. But that is how it felt. And once the police opened the trunk, that sentence became much more frightening. The boards were there. The rope was there. The guns were there. All of it had been only a few feet behind me while we drove back from lunch. That detail really gets to me. During the ride, I was trying to stay calm because I did not know whether Dave was serious. Meanwhile, everything was right there in the trunk. I was sitting inches away from someone who was angry enough to talk about hurting people, while several guns were behind us. I had no idea. I think about the lunch itself differently now, too. When he told me I was one of the few people he liked, I originally took it as a compliment. Later, it sounded more like something else. Maybe he was deciding who deserved to be spared. Again, I do not know. I hope I am wrong. I hope he was simply upset and talking without thinking. I hope the things in the trunk had no connection to what he said, but I would never take that chance. The entire experience changed how I react when someone makes specific threats. There is a difference between saying, "I hate that place," and explaining how you could lock the doors and burn it. There is a difference between being angry at your former boss and saying there are people you want to hurt. There is a difference between venting and describing methods. At lunch, I slowly watched the conversation move from one category into the other. At first, I felt sorry for Dave. Then I felt uncomfortable. Then I felt afraid. By the time I got out of the car, I was relieved just to be away from him. And by the time I saw him still sitting outside, I knew we had to do something. I have sometimes wondered whether Dave realized that I was the reason the police came. Maybe he did. Maybe it was obvious. I never spoke to him afterward. I did not want to. I hope he got the help he needed. I hope whatever was happening in his mind that day was treated. I do not have any interest in turning him into some kind of monster. He was clearly not doing well. He had lost his job. He felt betrayed. He was angry. Maybe he was depressed or having some kind of crisis. People in crisis can say and do frightening things. That does not mean they cannot be helped. But sympathy does not mean ignoring danger. You can feel sorry for someone and still protect yourself from them. That was something I had to understand that day. I could sympathize with Dave losing his job. I could understand why he felt hurt. I could even understand him being angry with the new owners. But once he started talking about harming people, my responsibility changed. The safety of everyone in the building mattered more than protecting his feelings. The police handled the rest. No one was hurt. That is what I remind myself whenever I think about it. But there are still moments when I imagine the other version of that afternoon. The version where I decide I am overreacting. I go back to work. I see Dave sitting in the parking lot, but say nothing. My boss never calls 911. The police never come. A few minutes later, Dave gets out of his car. He opens the trunk. That is usually where I stop imagining it. There is no reason to go further. The real ending was better. We spoke up. The police arrived. They found what was in the car before anything happened. I could not work for the rest of that day. My nerves were completely shot. Every normal sound made me jump. Every person walking through the door caught my attention. I just wanted to go home. When I finally did, I kept replaying everything. The phone call, the lunch, the car ride, his words, the parking lot, the police opening the trunk. It felt unreal. That morning had been completely ordinary. By afternoon, I was thinking about how close 75 people might have come to being in serious danger. 15 people had been fired. One of them came back. And I happened to be the person he invited to lunch. That thought still bothers me. I do not know whether Dave ever had a specific plan. I do not know whether he would have acted. Maybe the police stopped nothing. Maybe they stopped everything. There is no way to know. But when I remember the way he looked at me and said that I was his friend, I still get the same cold feeling I got that day. Because there are some things you do not need to hear twice. And when someone who has just been fired starts explaining how easy it would be to trap his former coworkers inside their workplace and hurt them, you do not wait around to find out whether he is serious.